Hey everyone, welcome to Paranormal M. If you enjoy the stories in this video, please give it a like. And if you've had a paranormal experience you can't explain, feel free to send it to me. The first story is about two friends who noticed something unusual the day after someone close to them passed away. One was visited by a gray and orange bird, and the other by a gray and orange cat. Neither animal stayed long, but both encounters felt strangely personal. Maybe it was a coincidence, but to them, it felt like a goodbye. Sleep well tonight. I'm truly sorry for your loss. I know that kind of grief, because I lost a close friend in a very similar way. At the time, I lived in a small apartment complex beside an old cemetery. There was another building next to ours, where my friend's mother lived. Behind the apartments was a narrow parking area, then a high metal fence, and beyond that, rows of trees and headstones. One night, my friend stayed with his mother. Sometime before morning, he left the apartment, entered the cemetery, and took his own life beneath one of the trees. That realization stayed with me for a long time. While I had been sleeping safely in my bed, he had been only a short distance away. I kept wondering whether there had been some moment when I could have heard him, seen him, or somehow known that he needed help. The following afternoon, I was at work and stepped outside for a break. Almost immediately, I noticed a bird chirping nearby. At first, I ignored it. Birds were always around, so there was nothing unusual about hearing one. But this bird would not stop. Every time I moved toward the building, its calls became louder and more urgent. It honestly felt as though it was trying to get my attention. Not just anyone's attention. Mine. I remember saying out loud, "All right, what is going on with this bird?" I followed the sound, thinking it might be injured. When I reached my truck, I found it perched on the running board. It was a small bird with soft gray feathers and unusual rust-orange markings along its chest and wings. I had never seen one like it before. It was not hurt or frightened. It hopped around happily, chirping while looking directly at me. I spoke to it without even thinking. "Hey, little bird, what are you doing here?" It suddenly flew up and hovered near me for a few seconds. The entire time it seemed to hold my gaze. Then it gave a few bright, cheerful chirps and flew away. I know how strange this sounds, but in that moment, I felt certain it was connected to my friend. It felt as though he had found a way to come close one last time and say goodbye. I could not explain why I felt that way. It was simply a feeling that arrived whole, without logic or warning. The bird had appeared where it did not belong, behaved in a way I had never experienced, and disappeared as soon as I acknowledged it. A few days later, another close friend told me something that made the experience even harder to dismiss. He had not heard my story about the bird yet. He told me that the morning after our friend died, a stray cat appeared outside his kitchen window. He rarely saw cats near his house, but this one sat beneath the window, meowing and pawing repeatedly at the screen. He was exhausted and overwhelmed with grief, so he tried to ignore it. Still, the cat continued. It stared directly at him, calling and tapping at the window as though it needed him to come closer. Finally, he said, "What do you want from me?" He opened the door, and the cat ran a few steps into the yard. Then it stopped, turned around, and looked back at him. According to him, it appeared almost joyful. It gave one soft, gentle meow before disappearing between the neighboring houses. He never saw it again. Then he described its coloring. The cat was gray, with patches of rust-orange fur. He admitted that the encounter had made him feel foolish and comforted at the same time. He could not explain it, but he believed our friend had come to say goodbye. That was when I finally told him about the bird. Maybe one of those experiences could have been dismissed as coincidence, but both happened within the same short window of time, to two people who had been close to our friend. Both animals behaved as though they were seeking one particular person's attention, and both carried that same unusual mixture of gray and orange. I still do not know exactly what happened. Maybe grief makes us notice meaning in places we might otherwise overlook. Maybe the world occasionally gives us a moment of comfort when we need it most. Or perhaps our friend really did find two small, unexpected ways to visit us before moving on. Whatever the explanation, I have never forgotten that bird. And a part of me will always believe it was his final goodbye. I used to live in an old house that I'm convinced was haunted by more than one presence. The first one felt human. I was told that a man had passed away after a long illness in the small bedroom at the back of the house. Whenever I closed the blinds in that room, I'd find them damaged the next morning. The slats would be bent and twisted apart, almost as though someone had forced their fingers through them to look outside. I replaced those blinds several times before finally giving up. I just left the window uncovered. Honestly, I was tired of spending money on something that kept getting destroyed. Then there was this little statue in the entryway. It was a ceramic fairy lying on her stomach, reading a tiny book. One evening, my daughter and I were sitting together in the living room when we heard a loud scraping sound from the hallway. We both froze and looked at each other. We searched the entire downstairs, trying to figure out what had caused it. That's when we found the fairy statue. It had moved from the table near the front door all the way across the entryway. It hadn't fallen or rolled. It was still sitting upright, just on the opposite side of the room. Neither of us had touched it. But the worst part of the house was a room in the basement. The moment I stepped near it, I felt this heavy, sickening pressure. It didn't feel like an ordinary spirit. It felt angry. I avoided that room whenever I could. One night, I woke up and saw something inside my bedroom closet. It wasn't shaped like a person. It was more like a mass of darkness, darker than the room around it. I could feel it watching me. Then, without warning, it rushed toward the bed and slammed into me with this overwhelming sense of hatred and rage. I can't properly explain what it felt like. I just knew it wasn't human. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, praying and asking the relatives I had lost to stand around my bed and protect me. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I had to confront whatever was in that basement. I walked into the room and spoke out loud. I said, "I know you don't want me here. I'll respect your space, but you need to leave me alone." After that, it never entered my bedroom again. Still, whenever I passed the basement door, I could feel it down there, waiting. And when I say it, I don't mean the spirit of someone who had died. This felt like something else entirely. There were smaller incidents too, although they didn't feel small at the time. The kitchen had an old ceiling fan with pull cords hanging from it. I'm only about 5'2", and the ceilings in that house were unusually high, so I couldn't reach the cords. I never used the fan. One afternoon, it suddenly switched on by itself. It started spinning faster and faster. Because it hadn't been used in years, it was badly unbalanced. The whole fixture began wobbling so violently that I thought it might tear itself out of the ceiling. I had to hit the wall switch and cut the power to stop it. That frightened me more than I'd like to admit. Then, one day, a woman knocked on my front door. She explained that she and her brother had grown up in the house and wondered whether they could come inside to see how it had changed. Their father still lived nearby, and I knew him, so I felt comfortable letting them in. They were lovely people. We walked through the rooms together while they shared memories of growing up there. Eventually, one of them hesitated and asked, "Has anything strange ever happened to you in this house?" When I began telling them what I had experienced, their faces lit up with recognition. They had stories too. A lot of them. They told me that unusual things had happened throughout their childhood, including unexplained noises, objects moving, and frightening experiences near the basement. Hearing that was strangely comforting because it confirmed that I hadn't imagined everything. That house really was haunted. I was deeply relieved when I finally moved away. I did feel guilty for not warning the people who bought it, but they've lived there for quite a while now, so perhaps the house treats them differently. I've always been sensitive to energy. I'm a spiritual person, and I've also practiced Reiki for years, so maybe I notice certain things more easily than other people do. Still, whatever lived in that basement was unlike anything I had encountered before. The only thing I'm truly grateful for is that it stayed behind. It didn't follow me to my new home. I don't think the house I grew up in was always haunted. Honestly, most of my childhood there felt completely normal. But sometime during the last year or two, it started to feel like someone brought something into my parents' home, and whatever it is, has been making itself very comfortable. The strange thing is, it seems especially interested in doors. One afternoon, my parents found that the guest room door had somehow locked from the inside. There was no one in the room, and the door didn't even have an outside keyhole. My mom and dad both tried the handle, but it wouldn't move. Then, I walked over and tried it. The door opened immediately, almost like it had never been locked at all. My mom stared at me, completely stunned. I just stared back at her with the same expression, because neither of us had any idea what had happened. I practice witchcraft, so part of me wondered whether that had something to do with why it opened for me, but I still can't explain it. Another night, a door near that same room was sitting halfway open. There were no fans running, no open windows, and no noticeable breeze. Still, the door slowly began swinging back and forth, making this long, dramatic creaking sound. Of course, it happened while I was alone watching a horror movie after midnight. I finally turned toward it and said, "You need to stop that right now. I am not doing this tonight." And the door stopped. Completely. There was also the evening my parents were away for a few days. My brother and I were downstairs eating dinner when we heard loud noises coming from their bedroom upstairs. It sounded like someone was dragging suitcases across the floor and shifting heavy furniture around. We thought maybe one of our other siblings had stopped by to pick something up, so we went upstairs to say hello. The bedroom was empty. Nothing had been moved, and there was no one else in the house. My dad has experienced things too. One morning, he told my mom and me that he had woken up during the night because someone seemed to be tugging on his ankles. He assumed one of us was playing a strange prank on him, but when he opened his eyes, there was nobody there. My mom was still asleep beside him. We told him very sincerely that pulling him out of bed by the ankles was not exactly our idea of a good joke. The incident that upset me the most involved a deck of cards. My dad had traveled to Portugal and brought home a beautiful traditional playing card deck for me because I practice cartomancy. I absolutely loved it. Whenever I get a new deck, I carry it around for the first few weeks so I can become familiar with it and let it absorb some of my energy. Then, one evening, the deck disappeared. I searched everywhere. I emptied drawers, checked bags, looked beneath furniture, and stripped my bed completely. My mom helped me search too. We shook out the blankets, lifted the mattress, checked between the bed and the wall, and searched my room more than once. The cards were nowhere. I even looked online to see whether I could order another deck, but the shop didn't ship to our country. I felt terrible. I had only just received them, and I was convinced I had already lost them. I ended up crying before I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up and reached beneath the covers for my phone. The deck was lying right beside it. Not underneath the mattress, not hidden inside the blankets. It was sitting in plain sight, exactly where both my mom and I would have seen it the night before. We had completely taken that bed apart. There was no reasonable way those cards had been there the entire time. But the strangest experience happened before a family brunch. We live in a 2-story house, and my bedroom is the first room at the top of the stairs. From my front window, I can clearly see anyone approaching the house. My mom had invited 2 of my aunts over for brunch because one of them was moving to another city. The meal was planned for noon, but at around 10 in the morning, I looked outside and saw my Aunt Serena walking through the front door. I remember thinking it was strange because she is famously late to everything. Seeing her arrive 2 hours early felt almost more supernatural than anything else. Still, I went downstairs to greet her. Only my mom was there. I asked, "Where's Aunt Serena?" My mom looked confused and said, "She isn't here yet." I told her I had just watched Serena enter the house. I had clearly seen her long, unmistakable curls. There was no chance I had mistaken her for somebody else. My mom began calling her sister's name and checking the rooms. No one answered. At noon, my other aunt, Mara, arrived. She asked where Serena was, and we told her she still hadn't shown up. Mara frowned and said, "What are you talking about? I could hear her laughing in the backyard when I walked up." That was the moment the 3 of us became genuinely frightened. I had seen Serena enter the house. Mara had heard her voice, but Serena wasn't there. The real Serena finally arrived almost 2 hours later, late as usual, and completely unaware that some version of her had apparently visited before she did. I still don't know what is inside that house, or whether all these events are connected. Maybe there are explanations for some of them, but there is one thing I know for certain. Whenever I visit my parents now, I keep a very close eye on the doors. I've had strange experiences for as long as I can remember. Sometimes what I saw looked completely solid, like an ordinary person standing right in front of me. Other times, it was transparent, almost like the air had briefly taken on a human shape. One night, around 2:30 in the morning, I stepped into the hallway to use the bathroom. I saw an older East Asian woman standing nearby, and I could have sworn I heard her softly whisper, "Hey." Then she was gone. On another night, I was in the bathroom when I saw half of a young man's face appear near the doorway. He looked South or Southeast Asian, but I only saw him for a second. Another time, the face of a Japanese woman seemed to emerge from nowhere inside my bedroom. I've seen other unfamiliar faces too, including a Polynesian-looking woman leaning over me while I was lying in bed. That one honestly frightened me. A lot of these experiences became more intense when I worked nights at a large retail store. I once saw a pale-dressed figure walking through the back room. There was also one particular section of the building that felt unusually charged, almost like stepping into a pocket of heavy energy. I later heard rumors that the property may have been built near an old burial ground, though I never knew whether that was true. In the employee bathroom, I saw a pair of feet wearing flip-flops beside me. When I looked beneath the stall, no one was there. Near the lockers, I once noticed black athletic shoes and tan pants standing just around the corner. I assumed it was a coworker, but when I walked over, the area was empty. One evening, I watched the shape of a very tall, broad man come through the freezer doorway. For a moment, I thought he might have been Samoan or Tongan. He looked solid enough to be real, but he vanished before I could understand what I was seeing. I also had an experience while helping at a friend's workplace. I saw the upper half of a tan-skinned man watching us from behind a doorway. Later, I noticed another figure wearing dark, old-fashioned clothing that reminded me of something from the plantation era. That building followed me into my dreams. In one dream, I saw two men standing together inside it. Then something grabbed me, and I woke up suddenly. I remember hearing a voice say that seeing these things wasn't good for my mind. Not every experience looked human. Once, in my bathroom, I briefly saw a red, frightening face. I've also wondered about spirits that imitate people or copy familiar sounds. There was one presence that felt especially hostile toward me, and I remember asking aloud who it was. Part of me wondered whether it had once been human, although I had no real way of knowing. Physical things have happened too. Boxes fell from a shelf by themselves while I was working late one night in Hawaii. In a hotel room on the mainland, I woke to the sound of a large metal pot crashing onto the kitchen floor. When I checked, nothing had fallen. Years earlier, when I was staying with my girlfriend, the bathroom door seemed to move by itself. We left the building early that morning. It may have been a draft, but people had already told us the place had a strange history. Even my old school had stories. One classroom had once been part of a gymnasium, and someone discovered a cross beneath the building. A teacher told us that lights sometimes came on during the night, and chairs appeared to move when no one was inside. During an extremely stressful period in 2025, when I was being financially scammed, I felt something unusual near my front door, almost as though someone were trying to open it. Around that same time, I dreamed about a woman in a black dress who seemed angry that I was checking my bank account. I woke after feeling a sharp poke against my body. While staying at a resort near Waikoloa, I woke with the lights still on and saw a short, greenish figure moving on the bed. It wore a white shirt and brown shorts, but I couldn't make out a face. During that trip, I also thought I saw a woman and a large Hawaiian man standing in the room. One night at home, the living room suddenly seemed to glow as I walked toward the kitchen. I've also recorded footage that appeared to show a dark, trench-coated shape emerging from the den. I can't say with certainty what the camera captured, but seeing it unsettled me. I've sometimes had mental images of cloaked figures gathered around a circular table, watching from a distance. On another night, I was sleeping deeply when something tapped me awake. When I looked toward the television, I saw what appeared to be a red floral kimono, but there was no visible face above it. More recently, I was watching a supernatural television series when I noticed a dark, human-shaped form in the mirror. It looked as though it were reaching toward me, and then it disappeared. I've spent a lot of time wondering whether my religious beliefs, generosity, or habit of giving away my time and money had anything to do with these experiences. I honestly don't know. It's difficult to judge something that feels so personal and impossible to prove. I've also experienced moments that felt like random remote viewing, as though I were suddenly seeing places or people from far away. At work, I sometimes felt spiritually observed, and that feeling became deeply stressful. I still don't have a clear explanation for everything I've experienced. Some moments may have come from exhaustion, dreams, stress, shadows, or ordinary sounds that my mind interpreted in unusual ways. Others remain harder for me to explain. All I can really tell you is that, in those moments, the experiences felt real to me. And when they happened, I often felt as though the room around me had quietly changed, even when no one else could see it. I honestly don't know how to explain what I've seen without sounding a little strange. The best way I can describe it is that they seem out of place. It's usually not because of their clothes or anything obvious. It's more about where they're standing. You'll notice someone lingering in a spot where nobody would naturally stop, and the environment doesn't seem to respond to them. The grass doesn't bend beneath their feet. Leaves and dust move straight through them, Sometimes, the light around them looks slightly wrong, and they don't always appear as people. Every now and then, it's more like a distortion in the air, almost like the ripples you see above hot pavement in summer. You can make out the suggestion of a shape, but not enough detail to say exactly what you're looking at. I've never seen glowing halos or anything dramatic like that. In fact, seeing a complete, full-bodied figure is incredibly rare. Most of the time, you only catch part of something. A shadow, a pale outline, a strange patch of mist, a flicker of light that seems to move with purpose. I think that's probably why people describe so many different things. Some report transparent figures, dark silhouettes, glowing shapes, people in white clothing, angels, demons, or things they can't name at all. Maybe they aren't all the same. Maybe we're simply trying to describe something we don't fully understand. I do believe they can see us, although I can't prove it. Most of them don't seem interested in interacting. They don't rush toward you or hover around waiting to be noticed. They appear to be occupied with their own lives, or whatever remains of those lives. It reminds me of watching strangers pass one another at a market. Everyone has somewhere to be, and nobody pays much attention to anyone else. Sometimes I wonder whether some of them even realize they're dead. People who study paranormal activity often talk about residual hauntings, where the same moment repeats over and over like a recording. I understand the idea, but I've never personally seen the same figure repeatedly appear in one place or reenact a specific event. Nothing I've seen has ever approached me. I've never been startled by something suddenly appearing in my face. I can't communicate with them, and I don't sense their emotions. A close friend of mine has almost the opposite experience. She sometimes hears things or feels a presence, but she can't tell where it's coming from. I occasionally see something, but I don't hear or feel anything. Between the two of us, it's almost as though we each received half of the same strange ability. What I can say with confidence is that my experiences have never looked like anything you see on television. I haven't seen grotesque injuries, missing limbs, demonic faces, or creatures changing shape. Usually, the figures look ordinary. They're slightly transparent, almost like a projection. Other times, they appear as vapor or a ripple in the air, but there's still a clear enough outline to know that something is there. One of the clearest figures I ever saw was an older man standing behind an elementary school near the edge of a playground. He was wearing a dark jacket and neatly pressed trousers. He stood beside a wooden fence, staring toward a row of pine trees beyond the field. He looked calm, almost thoughtful. What caught my attention was everything moving through him. Tiny seeds were drifting through the air that afternoon, and they passed straight through his body. Children ran around nearby without noticing him. Parents talked among themselves, and not one person glanced in his direction. He stayed there for at least a minute. My friend finally asked what I was staring at. I turned toward her and said there was a man standing near the fence. When I looked back, he was gone. There was nowhere nearby he could have walked without me seeing him leave. That was one of the few times I've ever seen a complete figure from head to toe. Of course, maybe we're imagining all of it. Maybe our minds are filling in gaps or noticing patterns that aren't really there. I'm willing to admit that possibility. All I know is that nothing waits beside my bed at night. Nothing whispers my name or tries to contact me. I don't spend my evenings hearing footsteps in empty rooms or watching objects move by themselves. It's mostly just the occasional strange sighting. A person who doesn't quite belong. A shape that disappears when I look away. A moment that has no comfortable explanation. After a while, you stop panicking. You notice it, you wonder about it for a moment, and then you continue with your day. I'm sorry if this sounds like rambling. It's difficult to put something like this into words. But hopefully, it gives you a clearer idea of what these experiences have really been like for me. Let me tell you about a man named Alfred Finch. Investigators believed he may have harmed dozens of vulnerable children, some as young as 3. He deliberately targeted those he thought society would overlook: children from struggling families, children with disabilities, and children from marginalized communities. He reportedly believed that no one would search very hard for them. That thought alone tells you almost everything you need to know about him. Finch was a predator, a torturer, and a murderer. But one of the most disturbing parts of his story came years after a young girl disappeared. Her name was Gracie Benton, and she was 10 years old. Finch had approached her family using a false name and an invented story. He presented himself as friendly and respectable, brought food to their home, and gained the trust of Gracie's mother. He then offered to take the girl to a birthday celebration. Her mother agreed, believing her daughter would be safe. Gracie never came home. For years, her family lived without answers. They did not know where she had been taken or what had happened to her. Then, one day, Gracie's mother received a letter. The writer began calmly, almost politely. He told a long, bizarre story about a sailor who had supposedly traveled overseas during a famine and returned with horrifying appetites. The story was likely invented, but Finch used it to explain the thoughts he claimed had consumed him. Then the letter shifted. He reminded Gracie's mother of the afternoon he had visited her home. He mentioned the meal they shared and the small gifts he had brought. He described how Gracie had trusted him, sitting beside him and treating him with innocent affection. And then he confessed. He admitted that he had taken her to an abandoned house outside the city under the promise of attending a party. Gracie picked flowers while he went inside. When he called her upstairs, she quickly realized that something was terribly wrong. She tried to escape. She cried for her mother. But Finch overpowered her and killed her. The rest of the letter contained descriptions so cruel and calculated that they devastated Gracie's family and shocked even experienced investigators. He claimed to have dismembered her and consumed portions of her remains over several days. Whether every detail was true remains uncertain. Finch was known to invent stories and exaggerate his crimes, but investigators later found evidence connecting him to the abandoned property, and Gracie's belongings were discovered there. The letter had finally exposed the person responsible for her disappearance. Alfred Finch was arrested, placed on trial, and found guilty of murder. Despite questions surrounding his mental condition, the court sentenced him to death. At 66 years old, he was executed in the electric chair. But this story should not end with him. It should end with Gracie, a child who trusted an adult because she had been taught that adults were supposed to protect her. A child whose family never stopped wondering where she was. And a child whose name deserves to be remembered for more than the terrible things one man chose to do. I have come close to dying in a hospital, twice. The first time was during labor. I had been trying for hours, but nothing was progressing. The baby was simply too big, and I was beyond exhausted. I remember thinking, I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired. Then, the monitor started beeping. My vision blurred, and the room slowly turned a soft, misty gray. My final clear thought was about my baby. I just wanted to know that he was safe. Later, I learned that my blood pressure and pulse had dropped so severely that the medical team briefly lost me. But while that was happening, I saw something strange. The room suddenly seemed full of very tall visitors. They were standing around the edges of the room, and in my confused state, I thought some of them were standing on cabinets. I kept wondering why anyone had brought furniture into the room for them to stand on. They were already far too tall. Their bodies seemed bent beneath the ceiling. I had so many questions. Who were they? What was all the beeping? Was my baby all right? It probably lasted only a few seconds, but everything felt stretched out. The room moved in slow motion. There was no panic where I was. Everything felt quiet, gentle, and strangely safe. Then, I heard a buzzing sound. It was as though the sound had always been there at 0 volume, and someone suddenly turned the dial all the way up. It rose from silence to overwhelming noise in an instant. After that, everything disappeared into the gray mist. The next thing I remember is waking up in recovery many hours later. I'd had an emergency C-section. There had been seizures and complications, but the doctors managed to bring me back. What stayed with me most was the feeling I had around those visitors. They seemed concerned about me, but not in a frightening way. Their presence felt calm and almost protective. The second time happened during another pregnancy. I developed a severe antibiotic-resistant kidney infection. By the time I reached the hospital, my fever was already dangerously high. A couple of days later, it climbed to nearly 107 degrees and would not come down. I was only about 28 weeks pregnant. The doctors brought me paperwork authorizing them to deliver the baby if saving both of us became impossible. I tried to sign my name, but all I managed was a crooked line and a few little loops. I remember staring at it and thinking, that doesn't look anything like my signature. Everything seemed as though I were watching it through fogged-up goggles. The nurses kept replacing cold cloths and towels across my skin. There were several of them moving around me, but from my perspective, they were moving slowly and silently. The monitors were beeping, yet the urgency of the room felt distant. Someone shaved my stomach with a cheap disposable razor and apologized for doing it without shaving cream. Somehow, even then, I made a joke that ingrown hairs were probably the least of my problems. By that point, I believed I was dying. And strangely, I had accepted it. I felt hot, freezing, wet, and weightless all at once. The soft gray haze returned, and so did the tall visitors. They stood along the walls, hunched beneath the ceiling, watching everything. I was relieved to see them again. The doctor had been wearing a bright tropical shirt when he first came in to explain the paperwork. In my feverish state, I became convinced he had been called away from some beach concert. I even apologized for ruining his evening. He looked at me and said, "What are you talking about?" A few minutes later, someone helped him into a white surgical coat. Against the grayness of the room, he looked almost luminous. He stood nearby holding a scalpel, waiting. The room became strangely still. There was only the beeping, the cold towels moving across my skin, and the tall figures pressed against the walls. Then someone shouted, "It's coming down!" My fever had finally started to break. The entire room seemed to breathe out at once. Everything suddenly sped up again. The nurses moved quickly, voices returned, and the strange softness lifted. The tall visitors began to fade. In my mind, the cabinets they had been standing on disappeared with them. I later read theories about how extreme medical distress can alter the brain, distort time, and create powerful visual experiences. Maybe that explains the mist, the slow motion, and the buzzing sound. But it has never fully explained the visitors to me. I couldn't see their faces. They were only blurry figures, impossibly tall and bent beneath the ceiling. Still, in those moments, they felt just as real as the doctors and nurses around me. I've heard that same buzzing sound during another medical episode, when I lost consciousness almost instantly. I barely had time to think, what is that? Then, the world turned gray. Had I not awakened, that unfinished question would have been my final thought. But I did wake up. And even now, when I remember those rooms, I don't remember fear most clearly. I remember the softness. I remember the silence between the beeps. and I remember the tall visitors standing quietly at the edge of the room. I found my mom on her couch just a few hours after I had left her. When I walked out that day, she was alive and seemed completely herself. Coming back and realizing she was gone was a shock I still struggle to put into words. The following evening, I was walking through the room where she had died when something stopped me in my tracks. A warm, electric sensation moved through my entire body, and every hair on my arm stood up. Both of her cats froze at exactly the same moment. They were staring toward the ceiling as though they could see something I couldn't. It lasted perhaps 15 or 20 seconds, and then it was gone. The cats relaxed, I could move again, and the room felt ordinary. I've always believed that was my mom saying goodbye. I haven't experienced anything else quite like it. She has appeared in a few of my dreams, but only in the background, the way people we miss sometimes wander into ordinary dreams. There was never a clear message or a moment when I knew I was truly speaking with her. My son's experience was very different. He and my mother had always been incredibly close, but he was away when she passed. Calling him to tell him what had happened was one of the hardest things I have ever done. He was heartbroken. Not long afterward, he began having vivid, lucid dreams about her, even though he had never experienced lucid dreaming before. In those dreams, she appeared as she had when he was a child. She was healthy, energetic, and in the happiest years of her life. She told him he was going to be all right. She said it didn't matter that he had been away when she died. What mattered was everything they had shared while she was alive. Then they began reliving those memories together. In one of the dreams, they were joined by two former neighbors, Aunt Lena and Uncle Ray, who had passed away not long before my mother. Their own children had grown up and moved away, so they had treated my son like a nephew. He had spent countless afternoons with them when he was young. Aunt Lena had died after living with Alzheimer's disease. For years, she had barely seemed aware of where she was. Yet in the dream, she was completely herself again. The four of them sat together between their adjoining backyards, talking and laughing as though no time had passed at all. My son still considers those dreams a gift. They gave him a kind of comfort and closure that I don't think anything else could have provided. Strangely, experiences like this seem to run through the women in our family. A few weeks before my grandmother died from a stroke, she dreamed about my grandfather, who had already passed. They were standing in a bright field with a fence separating them. She told him she was going to climb over. He said, "No, you can't come across yet, but very soon there won't be a fence." She woke up annoyed with him because he wouldn't let her climb over. Still, after that dream, something in her changed. She seemed calmer and more prepared. A few weeks later, she was gone. My mother also said she had seen both of her parents after their deaths. She described them as full, solid figures, rather than shadows or fleeting shapes. They didn't speak or deliver a message. They simply appeared. There is one more family story that has always stayed with me. My great-grandmother became convinced that she and my great-grandfather were going to die in a car accident. She even warned the family not to organize the surprise anniversary celebration they were quietly planning for them. In the autumn of 1947, they visited my grandparents. On the morning they were due to leave, my great-grandmother became deeply upset. My mother was only 3 years old and asleep in bed, and my great-grandmother held on to her so tightly that the family practically had to pull her away. On the drive home, their car left the road and struck a concrete barrier. Cars were far less safe then, and the windshield was not made from modern safety glass. My great-grandmother was thrown through it and died from her injuries. My great-grandfather survived the crash, but he was never truly well again, either physically or emotionally. He died about a year later. The family said that, near the end, he repeated her name again and again until he finally passed. I don't claim to understand any of these experiences. Maybe grief reaches into dreams. Maybe love leaves impressions we can still feel. Or perhaps the people we lose sometimes find a way to remind us that the bond hasn't disappeared. All I know is that my mother's goodbye seemed to come as a brief current of warmth, while my son received whole conversations and memories. Different goodbyes, perhaps, but the same love. At the time, my boyfriend and I used to visit his parents pretty often. They lived out in the country, in this old farmhouse surrounded by fields and woods. It was peaceful during the day, but once the sun went down, the house had a completely different feeling. Almost every time I stayed there, I would hear a little girl giggling. Sometimes she would whisper that her name was Maisie. Her voice always sounded sweet and playful, never threatening, but I could never figure out where it was coming from. There were other strange moments too. One afternoon, I was leaning over the back of the couch, trying to reach something that had fallen behind it. Suddenly, I felt someone grab my ankle and shove my leg away. It felt exactly like a person thought I was about to kick them and had pushed my foot aside to protect themselves. I spun around immediately, but no one was there. Whenever I told my boyfriend or his parents about these things, they would laugh. His father jokingly called me the strange one because he did not believe in ghosts at all. Honestly, it never bothered me that they did not believe me. I knew what I had heard, and I knew what I had felt. One weekend, my boyfriend and I decided to stay overnight. His parents had several cats, and late that evening, I was stretched out on the living room couch watching television with one of the cats curled up on my chest. My boyfriend eventually said he was going upstairs to bed. I told him I was comfortable and would probably just fall asleep on the couch. The living room was tiny. The couch sat beneath a window, the television was tucked into the corner, and a narrow bathroom door stood just to the right of it. I was lying there, petting the cat and watching my show, when she suddenly let out this deep, low growl. Then she hissed. At first, I assumed another cat had wandered into the room, and she was warning it to stay away. I gently shushed her, stroked the top of her head, and kept watching television. A few seconds later, she growled again. That time, I looked down at her. Her entire body had gone stiff. Her pupils were enormous, her ears were pressed flat against her head, and she was staring directly at the bathroom doorway. I followed her gaze, fully expecting to see one of the other cats standing there. Instead, I saw a woman. She was tall, probably close to 6 feet, with very long dark hair divided into 2 braids that hung over her shoulders. She wore a loose, pale blue nightgown covered in tiny white flowers. The moonlight coming through the window behind me seemed to fall directly across her face and body. I could see everything clearly except her feet. She had warm brown skin and soft, striking features. She might have been indigenous or of mixed heritage. What unsettled me most was that she was not angry or frightening. She was smiling at me. It was a gentle smile, almost comforting. The cat suddenly launched herself off my chest and disappeared from the room. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I yanked the blanket over my head and began whispering the Lord's Prayer, asking whoever was there to please leave me alone. After a while, I slowly lowered the blanket. She was still there. She stood silently in the bathroom doorway, smiling at me and holding a small white flower between her hands. I pulled the blanket back over my head and stayed that way. Somehow, despite being terrified, I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I told my boyfriend and his parents exactly what I had seen. For once, his father did not laugh. He looked at me and said, "You know this area used to have a large indigenous community, don't you? Someone died in this house a long time ago. I always heard she belonged to one of the families who lived on this land. Years later, after the family suffered the loss of their daughter, they began experiencing strange things in the farmhouse themselves. They heard footsteps, saw doors move, and noticed objects appearing in places where no one had left them. After that, they finally believed me. And whenever I think about the woman in the blue nightgown, I still remember her smile. I was terrified that night, but looking back, I do not think she wanted to hurt me. I think she simply wanted someone to know she was still there. I've been hearing and seeing things since I was around 10 years old. The house I grew up in never felt peaceful to me. There was something there that looked like a small child, except it was completely black, almost like a shadow cut into the shape of a person. Sometimes it would stand at the end of the hallway and wave at me. Then, the moment I blinked or looked away, it would disappear. At night, I would feel it tap the bottom of my foot while I was lying in bed. My bedroom lights would switch on and off by themselves. Even when I was taking a shower, my radio would jump rapidly through different stations before stopping on loud static. Whenever I pulled the shower curtain back to look, the room would be empty. I spent years counting down the days until I could leave that house. My older brother saw things too. He was about 3 years older than me, and he often talked about seeing a tall man walk past his bedroom door late at night. It happened so frequently that, eventually, neither of us could pretend the house was normal. When I was 19, my grandfather died. He had been a cruel and deeply abusive man. He had hurt several members of our family, including my father's sisters, and when I was a little girl, he had tried to hurt me too. So when I heard that he was gone, I didn't feel grief. I felt relieved. Not long afterward, my grandmother suffered a stroke. She still lived in her apartment, but she needed nurses with her around the clock. One weekend, her regular nurse couldn't come, so my uncle asked me to stay with her. That evening, I helped my grandmother into bed, turned off the lights in her room, and made sure the apartment was locked. Then I went into the guest room across the hall. I lay on my side with my back facing the doorway, writing in my journal beneath the warm glow of a small lamp. Honestly, I was complaining about being there. I was young, tired, and frustrated that I had to spend my entire weekend taking care of her. Then I felt the bedsheet move. It shifted beside me and pulled slightly away from my body, exactly as it would if someone had just sat down on the edge of the mattress. I immediately looked over my shoulder, thinking my grandmother had come into the room. No one was there. The mattress was empty, but the sheet was still gathered beside me. I remember staring at it, trying to convince myself that I had moved without realizing it. After a moment, I took a breath, opened my journal again, and continued writing. That was when I felt the hands. They seemed to come from underneath the sheet. They moved over my legs and up my body, touching me in a way that made every part of me freeze with fear. I screamed and threw the covers off. As I sat upright, I saw something peering around the wooden base of the bed. At first, all I could see was its face. Then it slowly crawled out on its hands and knees. It had my grandfather's face, but everything about it was distorted. His pale blue eyes looked colder and larger than I remembered. His eyebrows curved unnaturally high above them. He wore the same cruel grin I had known as a child, but his mouth was filled with broken, jagged teeth. It crawled across the floor, passed through the open doorway, and disappeared into the dark hallway. I was beyond terrified. I couldn't move for several minutes. When I finally found my voice, I begins repeating the Lord's Prayer out loud. I said it again and again until morning. I never went back to sleep. The next day, I asked my grandmother how she had slept. She looked unsettled and said, "I had the strangest dream. I saw your grandfather, but something was wrong with him. He looked frightening. He didn't look completely human." The moment she said that, I called my uncle. I told him he needed to come and stay with his mother because I would not spend another night in that apartment. As soon as he arrived, I gathered my things and left. I never saw that creature again. Nothing like that has ever happened to me since. But even now, when I remember the way it crawled out from beneath that bed wearing my grandfather's face, I can still feel the fear of that night settling over me. Last story for tonight. My stepdad had been raising me since I was 2 years old. To me, he wasn't my stepdad. He was simply my dad, the only father I had ever known. I adored him. Honestly, I was closer to him than I was to my own mother. This happened in 2016. My grandmother was 91 and nearing the end of her life. It wasn't sudden. She had been slowly fading for weeks in a hospice facility. I lived several hours away and had 2 young children, so I drove into town, booked a small hotel room, and brought my 3-year-old with me. My best friend offered to watch my 6-year-old for a few days. I just wanted some quiet time beside my grandmother before she passed. My parents lived in another state too, but they drove in that same day to visit her. When I entered my grandmother's room and saw my mom and dad, something strange happened. The second my eyes met my dad's, my stomach dropped. It was that intense, panicked feeling I usually got when I was extremely nervous. But I wasn't nervous. I had already accepted that my grandmother was dying. I worked as a nurse, so death wasn't unfamiliar to me. I had sat beside patients and relatives during their final moments. My faith had always helped me see death as a passage rather than an ending. Still, every time I looked at my dad, that awful feeling returned. I asked him to watch my little boy while I hurried to the bathroom. It happened 2 or 3 times. Eventually, Dad laughed and said, "Jenna, are you pregnant or something?" I laughed it off and told him absolutely not. A little later, Mom suggested we leave, get something to eat, and return the next morning, assuming Grandma was still with us. As we walked down the hallway, Dad was telling me a funny story about a woman he worked with. Mom was a few steps ahead, lost in her own thoughts. Then, I heard someone running behind me. The footsteps were heavy and fast. I assumed it was one of the nurses coming to tell me something about Grandma. I interrupted Dad and said, "Hang on, I think the nurse needs me." He looked confused. Before I could turn completely around, a voice spoke directly into my right ear. "Prepare yourself. You are going to lose your father before your grandmother." I spun around. There was nobody there. The hallway behind us was empty. I turned back toward Dad, and he stared at me like I had lost my mind. "What on earth is wrong with you?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. I knew what I had heard, but it made no sense. Dad wasn't sick. He didn't have any serious health problems. I convinced myself that grief and exhaustion were playing tricks on me. We went to dinner together, and afterward, Mom hugged me goodbye. Dad had already started walking toward the door. I called after him, "Hey, you forgot my hug." He let out that big, hearty laugh of his, turned around, and wrapped his arms around me. Okay, he said. "I love you." "I love you too, Dad." For some reason, the fact that he had almost left without saying goodbye stayed with me. I strapped my little boy into his car seat and drove back to the hotel. The radio was off, the windows were closed, and snow had begun falling outside. That voice kept replaying in my mind. Finally, I began speaking out loud. "God, I feel like I'm losing my mind. But if that warning was really from you, please tell me again. Make it clear this time." A few moments later, I heard rustling in the back seat. I assumed my son was moving around, but when I checked the mirror, he was sound asleep. Then the voice came again, louder and firmer than before. I said, "Prepare yourself. You are going to lose your father before your grandmother." I could barely breathe. When I reached the hotel room, I broke down. I stood by the window watching the snow fall and begged God not to take my dad. Please, not him. My mother can't lose her mother and her husband at the same time. I still need my dad. We all need him. After a while, an unexpected calm settled over me. I felt reassured that I would have time to process what was coming and that, somehow, I would survive it. Then I started trying to bargain with the warning. I thought, I'll call Mom and tell her to take him to a doctor. But it was already late, and they were probably home asleep. So I decided I would call first thing in the morning and insist that Dad get checked. The next morning, my 3-year-old had the biggest meltdown of his young life. Nothing calmed him down. I became overwhelmed, rushed, and completely distracted. I forgot to call. When I finally remembered, I told myself, the message said I would have time. I'll call them in a little while. I was supposed to reach Grandma's room by noon, but because of the difficult morning, I arrived nearly an hour late. The moment I stepped inside, a nurse rushed into the room. "Is there a Jenna here?" she asked. "Jenna? Maybe Jennifer?" Her face was pale and frantic. I raised my hand and said, "I'm Jenna. What happened?" She told me I needed to call home immediately. There had been an emergency. My hands shook as I dialed. A relative answered and said, "You need to come home. Your father collapsed at a convenience store." I asked, "Collapsed? Do you mean he tripped?" She cut me off, crying. "I don't know. They were performing CPR. An ambulance took him to the hospital." Everything around me slowed down. The room began spinning, and I started screaming. "He's gone. I know he's gone. I was warned, and I didn't do anything. This is my fault." My dad died before my grandmother. Nearly a decade has passed, and I still cry when I tell this story. I miss his laugh. I miss his hugs. I miss the way his presence made the world feel safer. Part of me will probably always wonder whether I could have changed what happened. Deep down, I know I didn't understand the warning and had no way of knowing what to do. But grief doesn't always listen to reason. Years later, I discovered that my husband of 18 years had been unfaithful throughout much of our marriage, with coworkers and other women. That betrayal nearly destroyed me. But even that pain didn't compare to losing my dad. Some losses break your heart. Others leave an empty chair inside you that no one else can ever fill. I've had quite a few strange experiences, but there's one I still think about whenever it snows. I've always loved walking through the woods after a fresh snowfall. Everything feels peaceful and untouched, and I enjoy following animal tracks to see where they lead. One winter afternoon, after several inches of snow had fallen, I drove to a nature preserve just outside town. When I arrived, mine was the only car in the small gravel parking lot. I followed the main trail into the woods, stopping every so often to examine deer prints in the snow. It was still daylight, and I felt completely relaxed. Nothing seemed unusual or threatening. Farther along, the trail curved sharply to the right. Just before the bend stood 2 enormous trees. The one on the left was beside a steep ravine, while the tree on the right bordered a dense stretch of woods. As I approached them, I heard a faint rustling sound ahead of me. I stopped and looked up, but I couldn't see anything. After a few seconds, I lowered my eyes and continued searching for tracks. Then I heard it again. This time, when I looked up, I saw a man peering at me from behind the tree on the right. He had light brown hair, pale eyes, and he appeared to be crouching. He was wearing jeans and a dark green jacket with a gray stripe running down one sleeve. The moment I realized he was watching me, he suddenly darted across the trail in a low, hunched position and disappeared behind the tree beside the ravine. I froze. Every peaceful feeling I'd had vanished. I was alone, unarmed, and far enough from the parking lot that no one would hear me easily. My first thought was that he had been waiting for someone to come down the trail. I began walking backward, slowly at first, keeping my eyes fixed on the tree where he was hiding. I knew there were only two places he could go. He could climb down into the ravine, or he could come back onto the trail and move toward me. As I backed away, I quietly prayed for protection. Then, through the stillness of the snowy woods, I heard tires crunching over gravel in the parking lot. The snow made every sound seem unusually clear, almost as though it were traveling through a tunnel. A minute later, I heard footsteps behind me. A man appeared on the trail with a large golden retriever. As he passed, he politely said, "Excuse me." That was my chance. I immediately turned around and followed close behind him, probably much too close. He glanced over his shoulder and gave me a confused look, but he kept walking. I stayed right behind him as we approached the bend. I was certain the crouching man would still be hiding behind that tree. But when we passed it, no one was there. I stopped and stared. The man with the dog continued down the trail, but I couldn't move. The person I had seen had completely vanished. Then I looked at the snow. There were no footprints crossing from one tree to the other. There were no marks leading into the woods. There were no tracks going down the ravine. Nothing. The snow was deep, smooth, and completely undisturbed. That was the moment the hair rose on the back of my neck. There had been nearly a foot of snow on the ground. Any human being crossing that trail would have left clear footprints. But there weren't any. I ran all the way back to my car, locked the doors, and drove away. I never returned to that park. I grew up in a house that was eventually torn down because of everything that happened inside it. My family did not demolish it. The owner who bought it after us tried living there for a while, but he left pretty quickly. Then he rented it out for years, and somehow, nobody ever stayed longer than a few months. Eventually, he gave up and had the entire place knocked down. That probably sounds dramatic, but let me tell you what we experienced there. Before I was born, my parents bought the house as their first home. My mom was busy taking care of my older brother, so my dad would go over after work to paint and fix things up. One evening, he was painting the kitchen when he suddenly felt like someone was staring at him. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling kept getting stronger. When he finally looked toward the hallway, he saw the shadow of a man standing completely still in the doorway. There was no face, no movement, just the shape of someone watching him. My dad grabbed his things and left. He never worked in that house alone at night again. Before that evening, he did not believe in ghosts. Afterward, he never laughed at the idea again. My parents also had 2 border collies when they moved in. Both dogs refused to enter the house. They would stop at the doorway, pull against their leashes, and panic whenever anyone tried to bring them inside. Eventually, my parents had to find them another home. My mom remembers objects moving around by themselves. Things would disappear from one room and turn up days later somewhere completely different. I have one memory from Thanksgiving that is still perfectly clear. There was a candle sitting in the middle of the dining table. Everyone was talking when the candle suddenly slid several inches across the tablecloth. The strange part was that the cloth underneath it did not move or wrinkle. Everyone saw it. The entire room went quiet. When I was 4, I received a large stuffed doll for Christmas. On Christmas Eve, we opened one present before visiting my grandmother. When we returned home, every gift with my name on it had been ripped apart. The wrapping paper was shredded. Boxes were torn open. A few toys were damaged. My brother's presents were untouched. The worst incident happened when I was 5. There was a narrow crawl space connecting my bedroom to my older brother's room. Each side had a sliding wooden door with a small hook and ring latch. One afternoon, I crawled inside because I wanted to sneak into his room and scare him. Somehow, both doors became stuck. I do not remember any of this, but my family does. They even took photographs afterward. I was trapped in that crawl space for hours. My parents could hear me screaming, but neither door would open. Eventually, the police were called. Then, without anyone understanding how, one of the doors suddenly slid open. When they pulled me out, my voice was almost gone from screaming. There were long scratches covering my back. They looked like claw marks from a large animal. But the crawl space was fully drywalled. There were no exposed nails, sharp beams, or loose pieces of wood that could have caused them. That was the moment my parents decided we were leaving. We moved out a few weeks later. Years afterward, we learned that an older man named Roland had died of a heart attack in the downstairs hallway, right beside the kitchen. He had apparently been known as an angry, unpleasant man. That was the same hallway where my dad saw the shadow. What bothers me most is how clearly I remember the rest of the house. I remember the pattern in the carpet. I remember the little green tiles in the bathroom. I remember where my grandfather always sat and where my brother hid his BB pellets. I even remember the drawer where my dad kept his cinnamon candies. But I cannot remember a single moment from inside that crawl space. There is just nothing there. My parents would not let me go near the property for years. My uncle still lives a few streets away, and even though the house is gone now, we still take the longer road whenever we visit him. The strange thing is, I am a skeptic. I question everything. I look for faulty wiring, old pipes, shifting foundations, drafts, sleep paralysis, and every other ordinary explanation before I consider anything paranormal. That is actually why I became a ghost hunter. People often assume ghost hunters want every strange noise to be a spirit, but I am usually the person trying to prove that it is not. Most experiences have explanations. This one does not. I cannot explain the shadow my father saw. I cannot explain why the dogs refused to enter. I cannot explain the candle, the destroyed presents, or the marks on my back. And I cannot explain why my father still looks frightened whenever someone mentions that house. Some people are curious about the paranormal because it sounds exciting. For my family, it was never exciting. It was something we survived. And even now, with the house reduced to an empty patch of land, none of us wants to drive past the place where it once stood. I want to share something deeply personal with you. These events happened to my family and me in a home we once lived in near Thunder Bay, Ontario. Even now, looking back on it, there are moments that are difficult to put into words. A small part of our experience was eventually featured on a paranormal television series in an episode about demonic hauntings. We were grateful that our story was heard, but what appeared on screen was only a tiny fraction of what actually happened. Our interview lasted nearly 5 hours, yet we had no control over which parts were included. We never spoke with the actors who portrayed us, and some of the reenactments were much more dramatic than the reality. The woman playing me was shown constantly screaming and panicking, but that wasn't how I reacted. I was usually the calm one, especially when everyone else was frightened. We also never met the paranormal experts who commented on the episode. Strangely enough, years later, one of them became a close friend of mine. We both ended up working with the same paranormal radio network based in Louisiana, where I now host 2 live programs of my own. Life has a curious way of bringing people together. What the television episode didn't explain was that we weren't dealing with a single presence. There were at least 4 distinct entities in that house, and each one felt different. One of them was far more dangerous than the others. One evening, my partner Damien was suddenly lifted and thrown nearly 12 feet across the kitchen. He struck the floor so violently that I honestly thought I was going to lose him. After that night, we stopped allowing the entire household to sleep at the same time. Usually, I stayed awake. I would sit quietly and listen while everyone else slept, watching the hallways and checking each room to make sure they were safe. Every creak made my body tense. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. I was exhausted, but sleeping felt too dangerous. Over the years, we were scratched, bitten, burned, choked, and shoved by things we couldn't see. Sometimes we woke with marks on our bodies that hadn't been there the night before. Other times, the attacks happened while we were fully awake. And it wasn't only our family. Friends, relatives, and visitors witnessed things too. Some heard voices calling their names. Others saw figures moving through rooms, or felt something touch them when no one was nearby. A few people refused to return after spending only one evening inside the house. We endured those experiences for years. They changed the way we slept, the way we trusted our surroundings, and the way we understood the world around us. I know some people may find this difficult to believe, and I understand that. Before living in that house, I might have felt the same way. But we know what happened to us. We lived through it. And although we eventually left that home behind, there are certain memories that never completely leave you. Hi, I've had a handful of strange experiences throughout my life, though most of them happened years ago. The first story isn't something I remember myself. It's something my mother told me when I was older. At the time, my father was working overnight, so my mother was alone in the apartment with me. I was very young and already asleep in my room. She had stretched out on the sofa and was drifting off when she noticed something in the living room doorway. It looked like a pale cloud of smoke. She watched as it slowly gathered into the shape of a human face. It remained there for only a few moments before disappearing. She never saw it again, but the memory stayed with her for years. That apartment was unsettling in other ways too. My mother said the kitchen cupboards would sometimes swing open and slam shut without anyone touching them. Most of the strange activity seemed to happen around her. The whole place had a heavy atmosphere. Even as a child, I could feel it. Walking through the rooms sometimes felt like stepping into air that was too thick to breathe. There was always this quiet sense that something wasn't right. My father was also drinking heavily during that period. Most of the time he was gentle and loving, but when he drank too much, his personality could change completely. His face, his voice, even the way he carried himself felt unfamiliar. It frightened me, although I understand now that the alcohol was probably responsible. Eventually, we left that apartment and moved somewhere else. That's where I had an experience of my own. I was around 16, alone in my bedroom with music playing. I was tidying up, singing along, and dancing while I worked. At one point, I turned toward the window. Our apartment opened onto a large shared rooftop, and my bedroom looked directly across it. Standing outside was a tall, dark figure wearing what appeared to be a wide-brimmed hat. It wasn't moving. It was simply standing there, staring straight through the window at me. The fear hit me so quickly that I dropped to the floor. I didn't even try to run normally. I crawled out of the bedroom and called for my mother. She came immediately, but when we looked again, the rooftop was empty. For years, I didn't know what to make of it. Then, much later, I began reading stories about a shadowy figure people call the Hat Man. I can't prove that's what I saw, but the descriptions were disturbingly familiar. More strange things happened when I was in my 20s and living in a shared house with several other women. One night, everyone had gone to bed, and I was lying awake in the dark. There was just enough light in the room to see the outlines of my desk and furniture. That's when I noticed something hovering above the desk. It looked like a dense cloud of black mist, darker than everything around it. It slowly drifted across the room toward my bed. I remember lying there, watching it come closer, unsure whether I should move or scream. Then it simply faded away. That house had other unexplained sounds too. We would hear slow footsteps climbing the stairs, even when everyone was already in their rooms and no one else was inside. The most frightening experience happened one evening after I had just returned home. I walked into my bedroom, put my things down, and lay on the bed. Almost immediately, the temperature in the room dropped. It became so cold that I could feel it across my skin. Then I realized I couldn't move. I was completely awake. I had only been home for a minute or two, so I knew I hadn't fallen asleep. My mind was clear, and I could see the room around me, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't lift my arms. I couldn't sit up. I couldn't even call out. Eventually, the feeling released me, and the room slowly seemed normal again. I know some people would explain that experience as sleep paralysis, and perhaps they're right. Maybe there are ordinary explanations for all of these things. Still, when you're the one standing in the room, watching something impossible happen in front of you, it doesn't feel ordinary. Would I call these experiences paranormal? I think I would. I can't say exactly what I saw or why these things happened, but I've always believed that the world contains more than what we can easily see or understand. When I was about 10 years old, I saw something inside the cave on my grandparents' property that I still can't explain. I know how that sounds. Honestly, I don't even believe in creatures like wendigos. At least, I never did before this happened. But after all these years, I still haven't found a normal explanation for what we saw. The cave was in an area where indigenous hunters had once traveled. My grandparents had found dozens of arrowheads near the entrance, especially after heavy rain washed away the loose soil. The cave itself stretched deep beneath the property, with passages that supposedly continued for miles. That summer, my cousin's friend, Evan, came to stay with my grandparents. He had recently finished college and was taking a road trip across the country. He had grown up in a big city, so my grandpa and I spent the week showing him what rural life was like. We fished, repaired fences, rode around the property, and stayed outside until the fireflies came out. It had been a wonderful week. Then I told Evan about the cave. The moment he heard about it, he wanted to explore it. My grandpa normally went inside with me, but by then his knees and lower back were giving him trouble. The entrance required you to crawl on your hands and knees, and several passages had steep ledges running beside them. I had explored the cave plenty of times, though, and I promised Grandpa we wouldn't go very far. Since I knew the first section well, he agreed to let us go alone. We entered just before dusk. After crawling through the narrow opening, we reached the main chamber. The ceiling rose nearly 40 feet above us, and the room was wide enough that our flashlights couldn't illuminate the entire space at once. Beyond it, the main passage curved around a thick wall of stone. I was explaining the layout and warning Evan about the drop-offs when I noticed he wasn't listening anymore. He was staring past me. Then he shouted, "What the hell is that?" I turned around. There was a face peeking around the stone wall. That is the clearest way I can describe it. just a face, watching us from around the corner. Its skin was unnaturally pale, almost gray-white. The features looked stretched and narrow, and its eyes seemed far too dark. Both of our flashlight beams were pointed directly at it, so I know it wasn't just some vague shape hiding in the shadows. For a second, I couldn't move. Then fear took over. I spun around and ran for the entrance, with Evan right behind me. Near the narrow crawl space, I slammed my back against a low piece of rock. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs and dropped me to the ground. I remember thinking that I couldn't stop. Whatever happened, I could not stop inside that cave. So I crawled. I dragged myself through the last stretch as quickly as I could, scraping my knees and elbows against the stone. Evan came scrambling out behind me, and neither of us slowed down until we were well away from the entrance. Outside, he looked completely shaken. I asked him what he had seen. Before I described anything, he told me about the pale skin, the narrow face, and those dark, hollow-looking eyes. He had seen exactly what I had. When we returned to the house, we told my grandparents everything. At first, they listened and tried to calm us down. Later, they decided it must have been a raccoon or some other animal whose face had looked strange in the uneven light. But it wasn't a raccoon. Our flashlights had illuminated it clearly, and it had been standing high enough to look around the side of that wall. Evan and I both knew what we had seen, even if we didn't know what to call it. At that age, I had never heard much about wendigos, skinwalkers, or anything similar. I wasn't trying to match the experience to a story I already knew. To me, it was simply something pale and terrible that had been watching us from deeper inside the cave. A few weeks later, I was staying with my grandparents again and watching a late-night television show about unexplained creatures. An episode featured a tall, pale humanoid figure. The face looked almost identical to the one in the cave. I turned the television off, but I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake until sunlight began coming through the windows. My family still jokes about the whole thing. They say Evan and I frightened each other and turned an ordinary animal into a monster. Most of the time, I laugh along with them because it's easier than arguing. But I still remember that face. I remember the way it leaned around the wall, perfectly still, as though it had been waiting for us to notice it. I've returned to the cave several times since then, always with a group and proper safety equipment. I never enter alone, and I never go in unprepared. We haven't seen the creature again. And, truthfully, I hope we never do. I must have been about 5 years old when this happened. Not long before, I'd been badly hurt in an accident at home, and everyone assumed what came afterward was connected to that. The first time I saw him, I was lying in bed when something suddenly woke me. I looked toward the closet and saw a man standing there in the darkness. Strangely, I wasn't afraid at first. Back then, I loved watching an old detective cartoon called Detective Tracy. The figure in my closet reminded me of the main character. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long trench coat, but his whole body looked dark and shadowy. I couldn't make out his face at all, so I tried talking to him. "I know who you are," I said. "You're Detective Tracy." He seemed surprised that I could see him. "Why are you speaking to me?" he asked. "No one ever speaks to me." The moment I heard his voice, I knew he wasn't the cartoon detective. There was something cold about the way he spoke. Then he disappeared back into the closet. The following night, he returned. This time, I was terrified, but I still found the courage to speak. "I can't see your face," I told him. He didn't answer. "I need to see it," I said again, "so I'll know you're not Detective Tracy." He asked me who Detective Tracy was, and why I thought they looked alike when I couldn't even see his face. I tried to explain it the best way a little kid could. I told him about the hat, the trench coat, and the special wristwatch the detective used like a telephone. Then, his voice changed. "I am not Detective Tracy," he said, "and you must never speak to me again." He sounded so angry and threatening that I told him, "Then don't come back. I don't like you." But he did come back. On the third night, I screamed for him to go away. My older sister rushed into the room and told me I'd only had a nightmare, but I knew I had been awake. He would wake me deliberately and stand there watching me. There was something menacing about him, as though he enjoyed frightening me. For weeks, I cried whenever bedtime came. I begged not to be left alone, so my sister started sleeping beside me. Even then, the man returned. I would open my eyes and see him near the closet while my sister slept beside me. I'd shake her and whisper, "He's back. He's in there." Without even turning around, she would tell me it was only the darkness playing tricks on my eyes. That was when he smiled. I still couldn't see most of his face, but I could see the outline of his chin and a long, unnatural grin. A faint glow seemed to come from inside his mouth. It felt as though he wanted to make absolutely certain that I saw him, almost as though he found it funny that my sister didn't believe me. Eventually, my sister said she couldn't keep sleeping in my room because I woke her so often. Once she stopped, I became even more frightened, and I started wetting the bed. The adults became frustrated with me. Since the accident had happened several weeks earlier, they thought the nightmares and bedwetting were just ways of getting attention. They told me I needed to behave, and because I had described the figure as looking like Detective Tracy, they decided that proved I had invented the whole thing. They thought I was claiming the cartoon character was hiding in my closet, but that wasn't what I meant. I kept trying to explain that he only dressed like the detective. He wasn't the hero from the cartoon. He felt more like one of the villains. It seemed to go on forever. Night after night, I worried that he would return. Then one evening, my father finally marched into my room. He opened the closet and shouted into the darkness, "Detective Tracy, get out of this closet! Don't you ever come back!" Then he slammed the door shut and told me and my two sisters not to open it until he said it was safe. That closet stayed closed for more than a month, and the man never came through the closed door. For the first time in weeks, I could sleep. Eventually, one of my sisters asked our father whether she could get her shoes out of the closet. He looked confused and told her to simply open it. She reminded him, "You said we weren't allowed to open the door until you said it was okay, so the bad Detective Tracy wouldn't scare her anymore." The adults may have forgotten how real it felt to me, but I never did. I know I wasn't dreaming. I know I was awake. And after my father closed that closet door, I never saw the man in the hat again. When I was about 9 years old, I lived in the English countryside with my dad for a couple of years. We shared the place with a former Royal Protection officer who had once worked closely with Princess Diana and later became involved in one of my father's business ventures. And the house itself, well, calling it a house doesn't quite do it justice. It was an old, two-story chapel with a thatched roof, built sometime around the 14th century. According to the locals, members of the royal court had occasionally used it as a countryside retreat hundreds of years earlier. It stood on this enormous stretch of green land, with ancient trees, wild gardens, and a narrow stream winding through the property. Stonehenge was less than half an hour away. It was beautiful, peaceful even. But the moment we arrived, our new housemate skipped all the usual pleasantries. He didn't ask whether the journey had been comfortable or offer to show us around. He simply looked at my dad and me and said there was one rule we had to follow. Just one. He told us, "You're going to see things in this house. Quite a lot of things, actually. Most of them are harmless. Some are even friendly. But upstairs, there's a hallway. At the entrance, you'll see 2 bedrooms, one on each side. Farther along, there are paintings on the walls, narrow tables covered with books, and little decorations." Then his expression changed. Halfway down the hallway, all of that stops. No pictures, no furniture, nothing. Beyond that point are 2 more bedrooms. Whatever you do, do not walk into that empty part of the corridor. It isn't safe. Now, you have to remember, I was 9 years old. In my mind, I was completely indestructible. I had also grown up hearing strange stories because of my dad's work. I'd already experienced enough unusual things that ghosts and unexplained noises didn't frighten me. So the second this man told me not to go down that hallway, I knew I had to see it. Before either of them could stop me, I ran upstairs. And there it was, exactly as he had described. The first half of the corridor felt warm and lived in. There were framed portraits, shelves of books, small wooden tables, and old ornaments. Then, at a certain point, everything ended. It was almost as though an invisible line had been drawn across the floor. Behind me, I could hear my dad calling for me to come back downstairs, but I kept walking. I reached that dividing line and stepped across it. Only one step. Every hair on my body stood up at once. The air became freezing cold. I could suddenly see my breath drifting in front of my face, even though the hallway had been perfectly warm a second earlier. And then I felt something I've never been able to properly explain. It was as though my own thoughts were no longer inside my head. I could hear them around me, screaming, "Turn around. Run." So I did. I ran back down that hallway and flew down the stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. Until that moment, I don't think I had ever felt real terror. Not nervousness or childish fear, but the certainty that I had stepped into the presence of something that did not want me there. I never crossed that line again. The strange thing is, the rest of the house wasn't frightening at all. It felt more like a supernatural village, with generations of unseen residents quietly carrying on with their routines around us. We would hear billiard balls rolling and striking one another in the games room when nobody was inside. Kitchen cupboards opened and closed by themselves, as though someone were preparing a meal. In the downstairs bathroom, if you left the tap running and walked away, something would turn it off. And if you forgot to close the bathroom door behind you, the door would slowly swing shut on its own. Nearly every morning, we would find the dining chairs balanced upside down on top of the breakfast table, stacked together in a careful pyramid. It looked exactly like something from an old ghost film, except after a while, it simply became part of our morning routine. There were dozens of other incidents, far too many to describe in one sitting. Footsteps, moving shadows, objects appearing in different rooms, and the constant feeling that the house was crowded, even when only 3 of us were home. But apart from that forbidden hallway, none of it ever felt cruel or threatening. It was simply a very old building filled with echoes of people who, for whatever reason, had never completely left. Sometimes I wish every skeptic could spend just 5 minutes inside that old chapel. Not an entire night. Not even an hour. 5 minutes would be enough. Because I honestly believe that anyone who entered that beautiful old place would leave understanding that the world contains far more than what we can see. I've got 2 stories I've never been able to fully explain. They both happened sometime in the 2000s, and I'm still not sure I'd call them paranormal exactly. But strange? Absolutely. The kind of strange that settles into the back of your mind and keeps a little room there. The first one happened on an old back road in southern Maryland. I was driving late one night with a friend, Mara, and the road wasn't far from where we lived then. People around there had stories about it. Ghost lights, figures near the trees, things appearing where they shouldn't. So, naturally, we went looking. Not because we were brave, really. More because we were young, curious, and just foolish enough to think the dark might perform for us. It was summer, but not hot. The air coming through the open windows had that cool, damp feeling you get near fields and woods at night. We had the radio on low, just something humming in the background, though I couldn't tell you what it was now. Then we came up to a four-way stop. There was one flashing red traffic light hanging over the middle of the intersection, blinking slowly over everything. Off to the right there was this old service station. I mean old. It looked like it had closed in the late 1950s, and nobody had touched it since. There was a faded gas sign on a pole out front, the kind that used to be lit up by little round bulbs. And then I thought I heard music. I told Mara, "Turn the radio off for a second." She did, and we both went quiet. That's when we heard it clearly. Sleepwalk by Santo and Johnny, playing softly, like it was coming from those old metal horn speakers mounted above the pumps. We just sat there. The red light kept flashing over the station, over the sign, over the empty road. Nothing about it felt threatening. That was the odd part. It didn't feel like a horror movie. It felt peaceful, almost beautiful, like we had accidentally driven through a little pocket of somebody else's memory. We listened for a minute or two, then drove on. The next day, I said, "We should go back and take pictures of that old gas station in daylight." Mara agreed right away. We grabbed coffee and headed back out, both of us kind of excited to see it again. After about 15 minutes, we came around the bend, and there was the intersection. There was the flashing red light. There was the old gas sign. But the station was gone. Not closed, not boarded up. Gone. There was just an empty concrete pad with weeds growing through the cracks. The kind of weeds that had clearly been there for years. There was no way a full service station had been standing there the night before. But we had both seen it. We had both heard the music. Neither of us said much after that. The whole day changed shape somehow. It felt like we'd stepped into something we weren't supposed to notice, and then the world quietly corrected itself behind us. I still don't know what we saw. The second story happened on July 4th, 2008. A few friends and I had taken a boat out onto Trinity Lake in California. We'd spent the day tearing around the water, jumping off the boat while it was moving, then circling back to pick each other up. It was reckless in the way things sometimes are when everyone thinks they're too alive for anything bad to happen. By the time we were ready to head back, it was completely dark. Not city dark, lake dark. The kind where the sky is full of stars, but the water below you looks bottomless. One of our friends was still in the water, so we pulled up beside him and hauled him back into the boat. He stood there for half a second trying to get his balance, then slipped and fell right off the other side. We all started laughing. It was ridiculous, and the sound of it carried across the lake. Then two of us decided to jump in one last time before heading back. So three of us were in the water, splashing around, while one guy stayed in the boat. That's when he started yelling, "Guys, guys!" At first we thought he was joking. Then his voice changed. "Guys, get out of the water!" We looked up at him, and I remember seeing his face lit from below. That's when I looked down. The water beneath us was glowing. There was this large orange ball of light rising from deep below the surface, maybe 4 feet across, maybe bigger. It was moving up toward us, getting brighter and clearer every second. I can still see it in my head, that orange glow under the black water, our legs and feet lighting up as it came closer. We all started screaming. grown adults screaming like kids. The three of us in the water scrambled for the boat at the same time, grabbing at the side, grabbing at each other, kicking, slipping, clawing our way in with no dignity at all. Just pure animal panic. We got back into the boat right before the light reached the place where we had been floating. And then it stopped. It shifted direction and sank back down into the lake. A few seconds later, the water was black again, completely black, like nothing had ever been there. None of us had an explanation then. I still don't have one now. This happened about a year and a half ago when we were on holiday in Turkey. We were staying at this resort in Antalya, right by the water, and one night my son, Leo, who was 10 at the time, and I got this lovely idea that we'd sleep out on the balcony so we could listen to the waves. In our heads, it was going to be peaceful and magical. You know, one of those holiday memories that feels all soft around the edges. In reality, it was not quite that. We didn't have enough pillows or blankets to make the balcony comfortable, so we were sort of shifting around on this hard little setup, trying to pretend it was cozy. And then, somewhere nearby, someone on another balcony had either a TV or a phone playing really loudly in German, so instead of the sound of the sea, we mostly had that. My husband was inside trying to sleep, and he was getting more and more annoyed because my son and I kept laughing and whispering. We were trying to be quiet, but you know how it is when you're trying not to laugh. Everything becomes 10 times funnier. Eventually, the person with the loud TV turned it off, and we both settled down properly. I thought, right, now we can actually sleep. And then a huge insect landed on me. I sat straight up and brushed it off, and that was it for me. I told Leo, "No, I'm done. This is uncomfortable, there are bugs, and we are absolutely not sleeping out here." But he said, No, let's just watch the sea for a little bit. Dad will be annoyed if we go back in and wake him up again." So we stayed there for a moment, looking out toward the beach. It wasn't far away, just a short walk from the hotel. The waves were dark and silver, and the whole place had that strange quiet you get at resorts late at night, where everything feels half asleep, but still somehow watching. Then I looked down. There was a path directly below our balcony. It ran past some sliding glass doors that led into the hotel, then along by an open-air restaurant area. And right in the middle of that path, there was this big, strange thing. I could not work out what I was looking at. I stared at it for a few seconds, waiting for my brain to make sense of it, but it just wouldn't. So I asked Leo, because I thought maybe his eyesight would be better in the dark. I said, "What is that?" And he went quiet for a second, then said, "I don't know." That made my stomach do this tiny little drop, because I expected him to say something normal. A trolley, a plant, a stack of chairs, anything. But he couldn't tell either. The only way I can describe what I saw is this. It looked like a huge pile of washing, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. It had a round sort of base, like it was sitting on the ground, and there was something like a pole sticking out of the top. On the end of that pole was what looked like a round glass lampshade or bulb. But the rest of it was just impossible. A big, messy, shapeless bundle. Like laundry, but not laundry. Like an object pretending to be an object and doing a terrible job of it. And the oddest part was that the path wasn't completely dark. There were lights around. This wasn't some shadowy corner where your eyes could invent things. It was right there, in the middle of the path. Then 2 men came walking into view from the beachside. They looked like they'd been out for the evening, dressed quite smartly, walking quickly and talking in Turkish. And they just walked past it. Not around it in a careful way, not slowing down, not looking at it. They passed either side of it, far too close, as if they didn't see it at all. I'm not saying they walked through it. They didn't. But they moved so close to it that it made no sense if that thing was really there in the ordinary way. It was big. It was in the middle of the path. You couldn't miss it. At that point, I said to Leo, "We're going down. I need to see what it is." By then, my husband was awake and irritated, asking what on earth we were doing, but we didn't really explain. We just put our shoes on and ran downstairs. We were only one floor up, so it couldn't have taken more than a minute. And when we got down there, it was gone. Completely gone. There was nothing outside the glass doors. No hotel staff, no trolley, no equipment being wheeled away, no pile of anything. The path was empty. And somehow I wasn't even surprised. The second I started running downstairs, I had this feeling that whatever it was, it wouldn't be there when we arrived. We walked around for a bit, checking the nearby area, but there was nothing. No explanation hiding behind a corner. No object that had been moved. Nothing that looked even slightly like what we had seen. I asked Leo, "Tell me exactly what you saw." And he said, "I don't know. It was like a giant shop stand with big postcards on it. But then it was also like a furry orange cat, like a man in a big costume. It was one thing and then the other." That really unsettled me, because that wasn't what I had seen. For me, it didn't change. I saw that strange tall pile with the glassy bulb shape on top. But for him, it seemed to shift between two completely different things. We went back upstairs, and my husband, still grumpy and half asleep, said it was probably just hotel workers moving equipment. But we would have seen them. We were down there so quickly. And whatever that thing was, it was big. If someone had moved it, we would have caught at least some sign of it. The thing that stays with me is how impossible it was to understand. Not frightening in a dramatic way, not like some monster from a film. Just wrong. Visually wrong. Like my brain kept trying to label it, and every label fell off. We were both wide awake. We hadn't dreamed it. We were talking, sitting up, looking straight at it. I've wondered so many times what it could have been. A djinn, maybe. Some kind of shape-shifting thing. Something that couldn't decide what it was supposed to look like to us. But that's the part I still can't get over. Because if you were trying to disguise yourself, why choose something so ridiculous? Why not look like a cleaning cart, or stacked chairs, or a plant pot? Something that belonged there. Instead, it looked like a giant heap of nonsense standing politely in the middle of a hotel path at night. And honestly, I still think about it all the time. I want to tell you about something that happened to me in broad daylight. Something I still don't fully know how to explain. I was sitting out in my backyard one afternoon, listening to music through my headphones, just having a quiet moment to myself. Then I heard this sound. At first, my mind tried to make sense of it as something familiar, maybe metal crashing together, like a car accident out front. So I stood up and looked toward the street. But there was nothing there. No accident. No cars pulled over. No one shouting. Nothing. I sat back down, confused, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized it hadn't really sounded like a crash at all. It was strange, almost mechanical, but not in any normal way. The closest thing I can compare it to is something from a science fiction movie, like a portal opening or time tearing open. I laughed it off at first and figured maybe my headphones had glitched. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, I heard the exact same sound again. And this time, there was no brushing it off. Right there, in front of my house, this enormous, luminous blue sphere appeared. It was huge, almost the size of two cars side by side. It looked like an orb, or maybe some kind of Merkaba shape, but it was also hard to pin down because it kept shifting. It was every shade of blue you could imagine. Deep blue, electric blue, pale blue, colors inside colors. Somehow it looked transparent and solid at the same time. It just hovered there in the air, and the light coming from it didn't feel like ordinary light. It looked alive. It moved and shimmered like it was breathing. I remember having the feeling that I wasn't just looking at an object. I was looking at something aware. Then I saw 2 cars coming down the street from opposite directions, and my first thought was, someone else is going to see this. Finally, I won't be the only one. But they didn't see it. Neither driver slowed down, neither one reacted. And as the cars passed through the sphere, the front of each car just vanished into it. For a split second, when both cars were inside it, they disappeared completely from view. Then they came out the other side and kept driving like nothing had happened. After that, the orb moved. It almost seemed to pull itself backward, like it was gathering force, and then it shot forward toward my front yard. I didn't know what to do with what I had just witnessed. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to find some ordinary explanation, but nothing fit. And then, later that night, something else happened. I was near the back of the house when I saw a tall figure made of white light moving along the side of my backyard. It had a human shape, but no face, no eyes, no mouth, no details. Just this bright, living white radiance. It moved incredibly fast, like it was sprinting, except it wasn't touching the ground. At first, I panicked. I ran back toward the door because my body reacted before my mind could catch up. But then, something strange happened. I realized I didn't actually feel afraid. Not really. There had been that first shock, that instinctive jolt, but underneath it was curiosity. More than that, there was a kind of calm. So I went back outside. I started down the steps into the yard, and I had barely reached the second step when the light being bolted behind a tree maybe 5 feet away from me. I froze. Then I felt this surge of energy shoot up through my body, starting from the soles of my feet and rushing all the way to the top of my head. It felt like lightning, but not painful. It was powerful, overwhelming, and somehow deeply familiar. That moment changed something in me. And the reason I say that is because, up until then, I had lived for years in a constant state of dissociation. Because of severe childhood trauma, I had been disconnected from my own body, my own emotions, my own sense of being here. People had often told me that my presence made them feel calm or safe, but I never understood it because I didn't feel that way inside myself. I had been cut off from my feelings for a very long time. I think some part of me had left in order to survive. But that night, after that encounter, I felt something return. I don't have perfect words for it. The closest I can say is that it felt like my soul finally felt safe enough to come back into my body. Afterward, I researched everything I could. I read about soul retrieval, about the idea that parts of us can leave during trauma and return when we are finally ready. I found stories and traditions that sounded close to what I experienced, but nothing that gave me complete proof or a neat explanation. I still don't have that. What I do have is what changed afterward. Since that night, my ability to feel has continued to grow. It's like something opened in me that has never fully closed again. I was already alive before, technically, but I was surviving more than living. That night felt different. That night, it felt like I came back. I should start by saying that whatever was happening out there has not happened in a while. It came up recently when my brother and I were talking about strange things we've experienced, and it made me realize I had never really told this story all the way through. Some of the details are a little blurry now because the strangest parts happened a couple of summers ago. So I'm only going to talk about the parts I feel sure about. I live out in a rural part of northern Georgia, close to the base of the Appalachian Mountains. It is quiet here in a way that feels heavy sometimes. At night, you mostly hear insects, leaves moving, maybe an animal calling from somewhere far off. Because of where I live, I've definitely wondered more than once if what I heard could be connected to some kind of local folklore or cryptid story. This started during the summer of 2023, sometime around late June, and it seemed to happen again during the same part of the year in 2024. The sounds always came from the far edge of my property, near a small pond that sits close to my neighbor's field. And what made it even stranger was the timing. It usually happened between about 10 at night and midnight, and then it would just stop. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a flute. It was very faint, almost buried underneath the cicadas and the wind moving through the trees. But it was there, a thin little tune drifting from the direction of the pond. I remember freezing because, in all the years I've lived here, I have never known anyone to be out there at night. The only things I ever see near that water are my neighbor's animals, mostly donkeys. The sound would fade in and out. Sometimes it got soft enough that I thought I was imagining it, and then it would rise again, just enough for me to know I wasn't. There may have been another sound too, something like slow, rhythmic tapping or drumming, but I'm less sure about that part. It's hazy. For most of 2023, that was all it was. Just that strange music now and then, always from the same direction. Then, in June of 2024, it came back. By that point, I started going outside and listening to it for longer stretches of time. Sometimes I would stand there for 10 or 15 minutes, just trying to figure out what I was hearing. I tried to get other people to come outside and listen, but every time I brought someone out, the sound would stop before they could hear it. After a while, strangely enough, I started to enjoy it. I told myself maybe someone nearby just liked playing music outside in the summer. Maybe they sat by the pond at night because it was peaceful. It was odd, sure, but I tried to convince myself it was harmless. Then I heard the children. It was brief, but I know what I heard. It sounded like 2 or maybe more small children talking over one another, almost like they were playing. Their voices seemed to move around near the pond, but there was no splashing, no footsteps, nothing else that made sense with it. Just those voices, and then silence. After that, I stopped going out of my way to listen for the music. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. The last time I remember hearing the flute was in July of 2024. Same place, same kind of tune. This time, I managed to get my younger brother outside in time, and he heard it too. That was honestly a relief, because it meant I wasn't the only one. He helped me explain to my family that there really did seem to be someone, or something, playing an instrument near the pond at night. There's one more detail that still bothers me. Near that pond, there's an old barn. It's run down now, half swallowed by trees, vines, and brush. At night, between the barn and the dark, you can't really see the pond at all. Years earlier, around 2017, before my current neighbors moved in, the property was empty and up for sale. A few of us went exploring back there. On the back side of the barn, I remember seeing writing painted in blue spray paint. I think it was either Spanish or Latin, and there was a star painted near it too. I started to read the words out loud, but someone immediately told me to stop, which, looking back, was probably fair. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now thinking about the music, the voices, the timing, and how it always seemed to come from that same isolated spot, I can't help feeling unsettled by it. Nothing happened at all during 2025. I haven't heard anything so far this year either. But I still think about it every summer. The strangest part is how seasonal it felt, almost like whatever was happening only came around during those warm months. And when I remember those childlike voices near the pond, late at night, from a place where no children should have been, I still get chills. I want to tell you about the closest thing I've ever had to a paranormal encounter. I know how strange it sounds. I know it probably sounds impossible. But this is one of those memories that never really loosened its grip on me. I was very young, maybe 5 or 6. It would have been sometime in the late 80s. Back then, I slept in a little loft area in the first place I ever remember having my own space. It wasn't exactly a bedroom. It was more like a raised room built into an old converted garage apartment my grandfather had put together. One night, I was lying there in bed when I heard tapping at the window. That alone didn't make sense. The window was too high for anyone to reach from outside unless they had a ladder. I remember staring toward it, confused, trying to see what was there. But beyond the glass was just darkness. Not normal nighttime darkness either. It felt thick, like the world outside had been swallowed. For some reason, I got out of bed. I didn't wake my parents, which still seems impossible to me because they were light sleepers. I just walked outside, quiet as anything, and ended up near one of the old storage sheds where we kept tools and random things. I remember the air feeling cold. I remember reaching up for the old brass doorknob. The shed sat a few feet off the ground, so I had to pull myself up to get inside. The sky above me was this deep, eerie blue. Not fully night yet, but right at that moment where the last trace of daylight disappears. Inside the shed, there wasn't any light, but I could still make out shapes. Shelves, tools, corners, dusty things stacked along the walls. And then I got that feeling. I was being watched. I looked up toward the peak of the slanted roof, where there was a small triangular window. And there, somehow inside the glass itself, was this thin, black figure. I don't mean it was standing behind the window. I mean it looked embedded in the glass. Perched there, waiting. It had a shape that was almost human, but not quite. It was too spindly, too wrong. It was darker than anything around it, like it didn't reflect light at all. Around its edges, there was this faint shimmer, almost like oil moving on water, or a badly animated shadow flickering where it shouldn't. As a kid, the only way I could understand it was to think of a Sesame Street puppet, something like Grover, but pitch black and completely featureless. Then it moved. It unfolded itself out of the window, and with one huge step, it was right in front of me. I froze. I don't mean I got scared and stood still. I mean I couldn't move. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then its round head began to split open sideways, like an enormous mouth. From inside it came this blinding light, every color at once, bursting out in sharp patterns, triangles inside triangles, circles flashing through them. A tunnel of color that kept folding into itself. And there was a sound. It filled my whole head. It was like countless trumpets playing the lowest notes possible, all wrong, all at once. I didn't just hear it. I felt it in my body. I have no idea how long it lasted. It felt endless and instant at the same time. The next thing I remember, I was standing inside the house at the front door, looking out through the glass panes. The sky outside had turned orange, probably from distant streetlights. I went back to bed, but something in me felt off for a long time after that. Over the years, I tried to explain what happened, but people dismissed it. I was too young. It was a dream. It was imagination. And honestly, I understand why they would say that. But it didn't stop there. Growing up, I would sometimes find myself wandering outside around dusk or near nighttime, and that same feeling would come back. That watched feeling. Sometimes I thought I caught a glimpse of something like that figure again. I lived in a wooded, rural area near a small creek. We had deer sometimes, and there were coyotes and mountain lions farther up in the hills. But this wasn't that. I knew what animals looked like. Every so often, even now, I still get the feeling that it's nearby. There was one awful night years later when someone at a party slipped something into my drink. Whatever it was, it brought back that same kind of experience. Only this time, the night sky looked bright green, and there were several of those figures around me. It didn't feel like they had entered our world. It felt like I had accidentally stepped into theirs. That night ended with me trying to sleep while one of them tapped on my window again and again. Sometimes it comes back in lucid dreams. Not in some strange fantasy place either. Usually I'm just in my room. It's at the window or standing beside my bed. I can see it even with my eyes closed. It still scares me. That same old terror comes rushing back. But over time, I've learned how to push against it. Sometimes I can even communicate with it, though not with words. It's more like feelings passing back and forth. And when I show it that I see it, when I face it without letting the fear take over completely, it changes. It almost seems startled, flustered maybe. Then it leaves. Sometimes it appears as someone else in dreams, or as something else entirely. But I can usually recognize it now. I know the feeling of it. I call it out, and it goes away. I don't pretend to know what it is. The closest description I've ever found is something like a black stick figure, though that still doesn't quite capture it. It seems to show up mostly from fall into spring, though I can't remember what season that first encounter happened. And look, I know how unbelievable this sounds. I really do. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was my mind creating something from darkness and childhood dread. Maybe it was never there at all. But whatever it was, the effect it had on me was real. And some nights, when the window taps or the room feels just a little too still, I remember that shape in the glass. I've always felt like I had a pretty strong sense of intuition. Not in a dramatic way, like I could predict the future or anything. It was more like this quiet inner alarm that would go off before I had any real reason to be afraid. And over time, I started to notice that anxiety and intuition didn't feel the same to me. Anxiety felt scattered, heavy, loud in a way that made everything blurry. But intuition felt clean and sudden, almost sharp, like something in my stomach had been tapped with the edge of a blade. The thing is, that feeling wasn't the only strange part of my childhood. When I was little, I used to have these nights where I felt like something was watching me while I was trying to fall asleep. Sometimes I'd be lying on my side, facing the wall, and I would get this overwhelming sense that someone was lying right behind me. Not touching me, not breathing on me, just there. It felt aware, and it felt wrong. I know that could easily be explained as a child being scared of the dark or having an overactive imagination. I've told myself that plenty of times. But then things changed after my family went through a really painful loss. After that, the house felt different. Things would fall off counters or shelves for no clear reason. Door handles would shake. The television would turn itself off and back on. Our dog would suddenly bark down the hallway or stare into empty corners like someone was standing there. At first, we all tried to brush it off. Old house, grief, stress, bad timing. But then, something started copying me. One night, my mom woke up because she heard my voice right next to her ear saying, "Mom, She said it sounded like I was trying to wake her up. She even felt a little tap, like someone had touched her. But I wasn't in the room. Another time, she heard her own name spoken in my voice. And on one of those nights, I wasn't even home. I was sleeping over at a friend's house. Then my older sister, Liana, had her own experience. She was in her room when she heard what sounded exactly like me outside her door. It was whispering her name, then saying, "Hey," over and over again. At first, she thought I was trying to scare her, so she ignored it. But it kept going. Finally, she snapped and told me to stop. That's when she said the voice changed. It wasn't my voice anymore. She said it turned into this horrible, growling, hissing sound right outside her room. She got so scared that she ran down the hallway to wake me up. And I remember that night clearly, because when she came to get me, I looked toward the dark end of the hallway and saw what looked like two cat-like eyes staring back at us. After a while, we had the house blessed, and honestly, after that, things seemed to stop. Years went by, and I tried not to think about it too much. But then I had another experience that still bothers me. I was taking a nap, and I had what felt like either a lucid dream or an out-of-body experience. I remember seeing myself asleep in bed. Then I was on the floor, crawling toward the clock in my room because I was trying to read the time. That's when I saw it. There was this dark, cloud-like shape hovering over my sleeping body. And then I heard a voice inside my head say, "We have you now." I know how all of this sounds. I really do. I'm open to the idea that some of it could be explained by grief, stress, sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, or the mind trying to make sense of fear. I'm not trying to force one explanation over another, but the part I keep coming back to is the mimicking. Why would something copy the voice of someone who is still alive? Why me specifically? That's the part I've never been able to shake. So I'm just wondering if anyone else has experienced anything like this, especially something imitating a living person's voice. I'd really appreciate any insight, even if it's just a grounded explanation or a similar story. My wife and I were talking about this again the other night, and even after all these years, I still don't know what to make of it. It happened about 6 years ago when we drove out to this small farming town for my cousin Daniel's wedding. I was in the wedding party, so there was no way I could skip it. The problem was, a few years before that, I'd been in a pretty serious car accident, and ever since then, long drives had made me anxious. But strangely enough, the drive there was fine. Calm even. We stayed in this little rental house outside town, tucked off a gravel road with fields on every side. It had this huge front window that looked out over nothing but dark farmland. During the day, it probably seemed peaceful. At night, it felt like the house was staring into a black ocean. The wedding was lovely, but we left early before the music and dancing really got going. We were tired, and honestly, I was already thinking about the drive back. We went to sleep early, but for some reason, both of us woke up around 4:15 in the morning, completely alert. I remember turning to my wife, who was my girlfriend back then, and saying, "I actually feel okay to drive. Maybe we should head home now, beat the traffic, grab coffee somewhere." So that's what we did. It was bitter cold outside, probably somewhere in the high 30s, and the world was pitch black except for a lonely porch light here and there. We packed up, got in the car, turned on some quiet music, and I pulled up the map. There was a back road route through the countryside that looked faster than the highway, so I took it. At first, everything felt fine. Then we passed this old barn. It was leaning a little, made of gray, weathered wood, sitting alone beside the road. The second we got near it, this dense fog seemed to appear from nowhere. Not a light mist. A thick, strange curtain of it wrapped around the barn like it belonged there. We drove straight through it, and I remember both of us commenting on how sudden it was. Then, the moment we came out the other side, headlights appeared behind us. A red pickup truck pulled onto the road right after us. Older model, beat up, with one headlight slightly brighter than the other. At first I thought, okay, someone else is out early. But then the truck started swerving. It drifted over the center line, then back again. It kept edging out like it was going to pass, then falling back behind us. I slowed down, thinking, go ahead, man, just pass. But when I slowed down, he slowed down too. Then he got right up on my bumper. And I mean close. So close I couldn't see the front of his truck anymore, just the glow filling the whole back window. This went on for maybe 20 minutes. He'd drop back, speed up, flash his brights, swerve like he was trying to scare us, then ride our bumper again. My hands were locked on the wheel. My wife was sitting perfectly still, watching him in the mirror. Neither of us wanted to say what we were both thinking. After about half an hour, he finally put on his turn signal, and I felt this huge rush of relief. We came up to a red light, and he was signaling like he was about to turn off. But when the light changed, he didn't turn. He stayed right behind us. That's when it stopped feeling like some reckless driver and started feeling deliberate. He kept doing it, swerving, flashing his lights, pretending to pass, pulling up so close it felt like he was trying to push us off the road. And the strangest part was that the fog never went away. It stayed around us the entire time, even though we were moving through miles of open country. It felt like we had driven into something and couldn't get out. After almost an hour of this, we finally reached a bigger main road. More lights, wider lanes, a few signs of civilization. And just like that, the truck backed off. It turned into an empty church parking lot, rolled slowly toward the far side, and disappeared into the darkness. We drove the rest of the way home barely saying a word. To this day, I still don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was just some dangerous lunatic on a back road at 4 in the morning. But every time I think about that barn, that fog, and those headlights appearing the second we came through it, I get the same cold feeling in my chest. Because it didn't feel random. It felt like something had been waiting. I'll call myself L for privacy. I'm 20 now, and when I look back on my life, it feels like I grew up between two very different worlds. Part of my childhood was in Florida, and part of it was in Alabama. I moved between my dad's side of the family and my mom's side, and both families had completely different ideas about the paranormal. My dad's side was very Catholic, but they also believed deeply in spirits, curses, reincarnation, dark presences, and brujeria. When I was little, there were rooms in my cousin's house that we were never allowed to go into. He was involved in witchcraft, and the adults took that seriously. My abuela would make us stay in our rooms whenever certain people came over. There was one man they called the Voodoo Man, and we were told not to look at him, speak to him, or ask anything about him. Back then, I was more curious than scared, but even as a child, I could tell the adults weren't pretending. They were genuinely afraid of certain things. Later, we moved to Alabama onto my mom's family land. That place had a completely different kind of heaviness to it. It was deep in the woods, behind a long gravel road and a locked gate. There were old barns, empty workshops, hunting trails, abandoned houses, and a family cemetery down the hill. Some of the graves had names, some didn't. Past the cemetery was my great-grandfather's old house, slowly falling apart in the woods. During the day, I would wander around because I was a curious kid. But at night, I wouldn't even look out the windows toward that cemetery. I didn't just feel creeped out there. I felt watched. And the strange thing is, my mom had felt it too, long before I was ever born. She told me her friends hated sleeping over because they thought the property was haunted. One night, One of her friends woke up crying because she said she saw lights moving through the cemetery and heard 3 loud knocks at the front door in the middle of the night. Her mom had to come get her around 2 a.m. because she was so terrified. My mom eventually admitted that she had always felt watched there too. Even my mama had stories about that land. There's one old family photograph that still bothers me. In it, my mama is standing in her garden, smiling at the camera. But behind her, there's a tall man nobody recognizes. He has light hair, pale eyes, and overalls on. He's standing there so clearly, like he meant to be in the picture. My family swears he wasn't there when the photo was taken. Nobody knows who he was. Something else has always made me uneasy too. People have always said I look exactly like my mom. Not just a little bit, almost identical. We even have photos of us at the same age, and honestly, if it weren't for the clothes, we could almost pass for the same person. Sometimes I wonder if whatever was on that land ever mistook me for her. One day, I asked my grandmother why some of the graves didn't have names. That was when she told me that, years ago, when plantations were still operating nearby, my family found a young runaway boy in the woods. He was very sick with a fever. They tried to help him, but he died there on the property, and they buried him near a tree. After I heard that, the whole place felt heavier. As I got older, I started hearing things. Footsteps, scratching in the walls, little sounds that made no sense, and all the time, I had this feeling that someone was standing just behind me. Eventually we moved away, but the feeling didn't completely leave. When I was about 13, we moved into an older house on a hill near a winding road. My room had this strange, locked compartment built into the wall above my bed. It had an old, rusted knob and a keyhole. I never opened it, but I hated sleeping under it. Around that time, my parents' relationship started falling apart, and the whole house felt tense and suffocating. Later, my mom met someone else, and we moved into a trailer in Florida with him and his family. From the moment I met him, something about him felt wrong. That was where I had the first experience I truly cannot explain. One summer night, I woke up suddenly with the feeling that something was staring at me. Everyone else was asleep. Down the hallway, there were sheer curtains, and it looked like something was moving behind them. Then the air turned freezing cold. It felt like pressure was pressing down on my chest and throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I just stared down the hallway, terrified, while my body felt weak and dizzy. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The next morning, I saw scratches along my side. After that, things in my life seemed to get worse, and through all of it, I always felt like something was close by. By freshman year, I became really interested in paranormal topics and spirituality. Not because I wanted to summon anything or invite anything in. I just wanted to understand what had been happening to me. Eventually, I moved in with my foster mom. Things were peaceful at first, but after a while, strange things started happening there too. Footsteps, scratching sounds, my doorknob rattling at night. One night around 3 a.m., my foster mom woke up angry because someone had been knocking on her bedroom door. My brothers were awake playing video games, and they swore they didn't knock. They said they hadn't even heard anything. The cameras didn't show anyone. Eventually, she got uncomfortable enough to ask me what I thought we should do. I suggested cleansing the house with sage and firmly saying that whatever was there wasn't welcome. And strangely enough, after that, things slowly stopped. Years later, I reconnected with my dad's side of the family and moved in for a while with my grandparents and aunt. That house felt unbearably heavy from the start. Everyone there openly admitted they heard and saw things. One morning, after I came home from a friend's house, my grandma and aunt asked me out of nowhere if I thought something might be attached to me. Then they asked if I had ever been baptized. I laughed at first because I thought they were joking. They were not joking. My aunt told me that a little girl had died in the house years ago, and that they sometimes saw her at night. She said the girl had black hair, a white dress, and no face. Then my aunt said something I've never forgotten. "She doesn't like you." Later, they had me sit alone in the back room, where most of the activity supposedly happened. Within minutes, the room turned freezing cold. I felt this overwhelming sadness and fear, like it had been poured over me. Then came that pressure again, all over my body, making it hard to breathe. Every part of me was screaming to get out. I finally ran out of the room shaking. My aunt later said my face looked different when I came out. After I sat down, they noticed 3 long scratches across my back. I still remember my grandmother praying over me afterward. The strangest part is that even after moving away, I still sometimes feel watched. Sometimes I hear scratching or movement at night. Nothing violent has happened recently, thankfully, but that feeling has never fully gone away. What really stays with me is how people react when I tell them about it. My boyfriend doesn't laugh or brush it off. He gets genuinely concerned. He's told me more than once that the things I describe don't sound normal, and sometimes he seems almost scared when I talk about them. Part of me wonders if growing up around fear, trauma, old family land, and strong spiritual beliefs shaped the way I see things. But another part of me can't ignore how consistent it has all been. Different houses, different people, different times in my life, and somehow, the same feeling always finds me. Before I get into this, I should probably say that I've never really been someone who believes in paranormal things. I'm not completely closed off to it, honestly. Part of me would love to be proven wrong. But whenever something strange has happened to me, my brain always tries to explain it away as stress, imagination, or maybe even some kind of hallucination. Still, these memories came back to me recently, and even now, they feel strange enough that I think they're worth telling. The first one happened when I was around 11 or 12, maybe a few weeks after my great-grandfather passed away. I was home by myself, just staying in my room like usual. At some point, I needed to go to the bathroom, so I got up and opened my bedroom door. And there he was. My great-grandfather was sitting on the floor in the hallway, right near my grandfather's bedroom door, looking straight at me. He didn't look sick. He didn't look like a ghost from a movie. He looked exactly the way I remembered him when he was alive. Real, solid, present. I froze. I don't think I even breathed properly for a few seconds. Then I shut my door and went right back into my room. I stayed there for what felt like forever, probably close to an hour, trying to convince myself to go back out. I kept telling myself I must have imagined it. I was scared, but I still really needed to use the bathroom, so eventually I opened the door again. He was still there. Same spot, same position, same quiet stare. That was enough for me. I closed the door, locked myself in my room, and stayed there until my parents came home. The next experiences happened years later when I was in high school. They weren't really one single event, more like the same thing happening more than once. The house I grew up in was split into 2 connected parts. One side had the bedrooms and living room, and the other side had the kitchen and bathroom. One night, I was in the bathroom when I suddenly heard stomping outside. And I don't mean normal footsteps. This sound was heavy, huge. It didn't sound like a person, and it didn't sound like an animal either. It was something moving back and forth between the 2 parts of the house, stomping hard enough that I could feel the fear crawl right up my spine. I just stayed in the bathroom, completely still, listening to it go on for at least 10 minutes. Even after it stopped, I waited nearly an hour before I worked up the courage to run back to my bedroom. Then it happened again another night. Same place, Same time of day, same awful stomping. I waited it out again, sitting there in the bathroom, trying to calm myself down. After it finally stopped, I thought, okay, this is my chance. I was getting ready to make a run for it. And then it started again. That time, I was trapped in there for hours, too scared to leave. It happened once when I was on the bedroom side of the house too, but I felt a little safer because my family was closer. Every time it happened, I told my parents. They went outside to check, but they never found anything. I even tried stomping as hard as I could later, just to see if I could recreate the sound. It wasn't even close. Not remotely. Those are the biggest memories, but they weren't the only ones. When I was younger, I was convinced our house was haunted. I would hear footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. I'd get this strong feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes the air in the house felt heavy, like something was nearby, just out of sight. I still don't know what any of it really was. Maybe there's a normal explanation. Maybe my mind was filling in the dark corners with things that weren't there. But I know how it felt. And at the time, it felt very, very real. I still don't really know what to make of this, and honestly, part of me keeps wondering if my brain was just exhausted and filling in shadows. Back in April, I moved out of a newer apartment and into an older place because the rent at my previous place had gotten completely out of hand. My landlord had already been frustrated with us being behind on rent a few times, and eventually, we were given 10 days to find somewhere else. So I was rushing, stressed, and just trying to land anywhere decent. That's how we ended up in this older apartment in downtown New Westminster. It was about $1,000 cheaper than what we had been paying before, which felt almost suspicious. We kept thinking, okay, there has to be something wrong with it. Mice, bugs, mold, noisy neighbors, something. But there wasn't anything obvious. It was still a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom place, just older. The appliances were dated, the carpet had seen better decades, and the tile looked tired. But when I first toured it, I didn't feel anything strange. The only real issue was that the landlords clearly hadn't cleaned it. So on moving day, I went over there by myself to deep clean while the movers were packing up the old apartment. That day turned into a marathon. The movers took something like 11 hours to get everything transferred over, and I was alone in the new place for most of it, scrubbing, wiping, unpacking little things, breathing in cleaning products, and running on stress. At some point, I started seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I told myself it was nothing. I was tired. I was overwhelmed. The apartment was unfamiliar. Maybe reflections were bouncing off something. Maybe I'd inhaled too much cleaner and my brain was throwing a tiny haunted house party without my permission. But then it kept happening. Eventually, I sat down in one of the bedrooms and watched a movie on my phone because I suddenly felt really uneasy. I couldn't explain it. I just needed to stop moving for a while. Later, after the movers finally left, my mom and I started unpacking together. And that's when I kept seeing him. Not clearly, never straight on, but always in the corner of my eye. It looked like a man walking quickly back and forth through the apartment, like he was pacing. Every time I turned my head to look directly at him, there was nothing there. No shadow, no person, no sound. Just empty space. But then, a few minutes later, there he'd be again, just at the edge of my vision. This went on for hours. We kept unpacking until around 2 or 3 in the morning, and by then I was completely drained. I finally sat down, trying to breathe and convince myself the whole day had just scrambled my senses. Then my mom came into my room and said, very quietly, I don't like saying this, but I think this apartment is haunted. I looked at her and asked, "Why would you say that?" And she said, "Because I keep seeing a man walking around out of the corner of my eye." That was the moment my stomach dropped. I hadn't told her what I'd been seeing, so I asked her to describe him. She said he looked like a white man, maybe late 20s or 30s, with brown hair cut just above his ears. She said he was wearing a beige, sleeveless shirt and blue jeans. And I just went cold, because that was exactly what I had been seeing all night. The hard part is, I'm not really someone who believes in this kind of thing. I'm agnostic, leaning more atheist, so ghosts and spirits have never been part of how I explain the world. But that night, I finally said out loud, "If someone is here, we don't want to see you. We know you're here, and we don't mean any harm, but please don't show yourself to us." And after that, things changed. It's been a couple of months now, and neither of us has seen him like we did that first night. Every now and then, one of us might catch a quick flicker of movement in our peripheral vision, but nothing as constant or as clear as that first night. So I'm still left wondering what actually happened. Was it stress? Exhaustion? Some weird trick of the eyes? Or is there some kind of phenomenon where two people can see the same figure, especially when it disappears the second you try to look straight at it? I went to Donner Memorial State Park last summer with my family while they were visiting us in California. My husband Mark and I thought it would be a meaningful place to take everyone. It was mid-July, one of those bright, hot, trucky days where the sky looks almost polished and everything around you feels green and alive. The trail there loops along Donner Creek. One side opens up near this flat, marshy meadow, and the other side is more wooded and shaded. We came in through the wooded entrance first, passing the huge boulder where one of the Donner Party cabins had once been built against it. After that, we crossed the creek and followed the path around the other side. I'm always stopping to take pictures, and that day was no different. The place looked strangely beautiful. Blue sky, tall evergreens, sunlit grass, all of it so peaceful on the surface. I remember thinking how odd it was that somewhere with such a tragic history could look that calm. At one point, I looked up from my phone and realized my family had already rounded a bend ahead of me. There were a few other visitors behind me on the trail, so I hurried a little to catch up. The path crossed a marshy section on a boardwalk, then changed into sandy ground before meeting a strip of asphalt. As I came around that curve, I suddenly felt like I had walked straight through something. The only way I can describe it is a spider web, but not a normal one. It felt thick, cold, and heavy, like it passed over my face and arms all at once. The strange thing was, there was nothing there. No web, no branch, nothing touching me. But my body reacted immediately. I shivered hard, even though it was hot outside. Every hair on my arms stood straight up. I got this deep wave of goosebumps, the kind that feels like your body knows something before your mind can explain it. And almost instantly, this awful sense of dread settled over me. I caught up with my family and showed them my arms. The goosebumps were still clearly visible. I told them what had happened and asked if they had felt anything in that spot, but none of them had. They were totally fine. No chill, no weird feeling, nothing. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. I felt uneasy for the rest of the walk, like something behind me had noticed me. It wasn't panic exactly. It was heavier than that. A kind of warning feeling, low and steady in my stomach. Eventually, once we went into the museum and wandered around the gift shop, the feeling faded enough that I could distract myself. I told myself it was probably just the weight of knowing what had happened there. I'm practical by nature, and I knew the history of the area. I figured maybe my imagination had gotten tangled up in the place. But then, about a year later, I was putting together a slideshow of our California trips. I came across the photos I had taken at the park, especially the ones from that exact stretch of trail. The photos looked completely normal. Bright sky, warm sunlight, green grass, tall trees. Nothing strange, nothing dark, nothing that should have bothered me. But the second I looked at them, my body reacted all over again. My stomach turned. I felt nauseous almost immediately. That same uneasy, sinking feeling came back, as if I were standing on that trail again. I had already added the photos to the slideshow, but after looking at them for a while and feeling worse instead of better, I removed them. That surprised me more than the original experience, honestly. I've seen plenty of disturbing things online over the years, and I've visited ghost towns, battlefields, old mines, caves, and abandoned cemeteries. I've been in places with sad or violent histories before, but I have never had my body react like that to a place. Even now, just talking about it, I can feel that queasy feeling starting again. I don't know what happened there. I don't know if I walked through some kind of energy, or if my body picked up on something my mind couldn't process, or if the history of that place simply landed on me in a way I wasn't expecting. All I know is that for one brief moment on that trail, everything beautiful around me stopped feeling beautiful. It felt like the place remembered something terrible, and for some reason, my body remembered it too. I lived in this little duplex out near the woods when I was a kid, but only for about 2 years. And honestly, I don't remember much from that place. Not because nothing happened there, but because that whole stretch of my life was heavy, blurry. The kind of time your brain quietly folds up and puts away somewhere dark. My mom's sister, my Auntie Lena, had passed away from cancer not long before. A few months later, my baby sister was born early, and she was really sick. Nobody knew if she was going to make it. My parents were barely holding themselves together. My dad was deep in addiction, and my mom was just trying to survive, medicated and numb, moving through the days like she was underwater. My little sister was named after my aunt, too, which made everything feel even more tender and painful. And if it hadn't been for my granny stepping in, I really believe my sisters and I might have ended up in foster care. I even failed first grade while we were living there. So when I say I don't remember much, I mean it feels like trying to look through fogged glass. This was more than 20 years ago. Anyway, not long ago, my older sister and I were talking about that duplex. We were remembering how strange it felt there, how creepy some of the nights were, and she brought up something that I had completely forgotten. A memory I guess my mind had buried so well that when she said it, I just sat there thinking, wait, what? There were 3 duplexes out there, tucked back near the bush across from the town airport. Ours was the closest to the main road. The one farthest down had a young brother and sister living in it, and my sisters and I became friends with them. They ended up moving away while we were still living in our place, but before they left, my mom let us sleep over at their house one night. I don't remember much about playing there during the day. I just remember the feeling of that house. It made me uneasy, not in a way I could explain as a kid, just this quiet wrongness sitting in the corners. That night, I slept in the little girl's bunk bed. She was on the bottom bunk, and I was on the top. I don't remember where my sister slept. I only remember being up there, feeling way too close to the ceiling, like the room was pressing down on me. At some point, I fell asleep. Then I woke up suddenly, and right away, I felt watched. Not just scared from a dream, not confused, watched. I was lying there under the blanket, completely frozen. The bunk bed was lined up with the doorway, so if I turned my head and looked over the edge, I could see straight out into the hall. And I remember feeling this pull toward the doorway, almost like my eyes were being dragged there. I didn't want to look. Every part of me was screaming not to look. I hid under the blanket, shaking, heart pounding so hard it felt like my whole body was buzzing. There's something about being a kid under a blanket that makes you think nothing can touch you there. Like cotton has magic in it. I stayed like that for as long as I could, but that feeling didn't go away. Eventually, I peeked. At first, everything was almost completely black. There was just a little bit of light coming in from the window near the foot of the bed, barely enough to see the room. I looked toward the window first, and everything seemed normal. Then my eyes moved to the doorway, and I saw something there. It looked almost like heat waves, or that weird shimmer you see above a barbecue when propane hits the air. It was thin and distorted at first. Then it started becoming more solid, turning into this faint white smoke. And then I realized it had a shape. A head. A body. Legs. Within a second, it looked like my Auntie Lena. That's the part that still bothers me, because she didn't look like the healthy version of herself. She looked the way I remembered her after chemo. She had on this blue coat, and she had her head wrap. I remember those details so clearly. The smoky white shape sort of shifted into color, and then there she was. As soon as I understood what I was seeing, I rolled onto my back and started sobbing. I didn't scream. I didn't climb down. I just stared at the ceiling and cried as quietly as I could, trying to breathe, trying to calm myself down. It felt like I lay there for hours. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I remember is later on, telling my older sister what had happened. She told my mom in the car on the way home, but I don't remember my mom's reaction. I don't even remember that conversation clearly. And then, somehow, I forgot the whole thing. Completely. When my sister reminded me years later, it hit me like a punch in the stomach. She said, "Remember when you saw Auntie Lena at the neighbor's house?" And I was just staring at her like, "What are you talking about?" Then she explained it. The sleepover, the bunk bed, what I told her the next morning. And all at once, the memory came back. Not slowly, not in pieces. It flooded in, and suddenly I was that scared little kid again, lying in the top bunk, staring at the doorway. Ever since then, I've gone back and forth about what it was. Part of me wonders if it really was my auntie. Another part of me thinks maybe I was just a traumatized kid, surrounded by grief and fear, and my brain created something out of all that darkness. Maybe I saw what I was most afraid of. Or maybe I saw what I missed. I don't know. The hardest part is that if it was her, I hate thinking she appeared to me still looking sick. But then again, maybe that was the only version of her my child mind could recognize. Maybe if there was something there, it came through in the only shape I knew. I still don't have an answer. I only know that the fear I felt that night was real. The memory, once it came back, felt real. And whether it was my auntie, my imagination, or some strange little doorway grief opened in my mind, I don't think I'll ever fully shake it. I was probably around 11 when all of this happened. My family had just moved into this new house, and honestly, at first, I loved everything about it. The backyard felt massive to me. My bedroom was bigger than any room I'd had before, and we even had a fireplace, which made the whole place feel warm and kind of magical. For a while, I really thought we had found the perfect home. But then, I started noticing something. It was this shadowy figure, always just at the edge of my vision. I'd see it for a split second, turn my head, and it would be gone. At first, I tried to brush it off. You know, little kid imagination, weird lighting, things like that. But my family had always said I had a strange sensitivity when it came to seeing or feeling things. So, part of me knew I shouldn't completely ignore it. It kept happening for a while, just quick glimpses here and there. And then one night, it changed. I was in the living room with my mom and my younger sister, and we were all watching TV together. I got up to use the bathroom, and I left the bathroom door open. From where I was sitting, I could see straight down the hallway into the living room. The kitchen was off to the side, and my bedroom was close by, right near the bathroom. While I was in there, I saw the shadow figure again. But this time, it didn't vanish. It came out from the kitchen and moved right across the hallway, directly in front of the bathroom door. Then it turned so sharply and went straight into my bedroom. And the speed of it was what scared me the most. It didn't move like a normal person. It was unnaturally fast, almost like something from a vampire show, but I could still clearly see it. It wasn't just a blur. It was there. I completely froze. Then I ran back into the living room, half-dressed and panicking, trying to tell my mom and sister what I had just seen. I could barely get the words out because I was so scared. After that night, I still caught little glimpses sometimes, but nothing ever happened as clearly or as terrifyingly as that. About a year later, my older sister Marissa got her first apartment. She was around 19, and she invited us over for a sleepover. Later that night, things had calmed down, and I was lying on her bed waiting for my other sister to finish showering so we could play Monopoly. Marissa walked past the bedroom, glanced in, and then suddenly stopped. She backed up slowly and just stared at me with this worried look on her face. She had always been very into spirits and paranormal things. She used to visit graveyards with her friends and believed she could sense things too. At first, she didn't really explain what was going on. She just started cleansing the apartment, and then she cleansed me too. After she finished, she finally told me what she had seen. She said there had been a shadow figure hovering above me, up in the corner of the room near the bed. She said it felt dark, evil even. And then she told me I didn't need to worry about that shadow figure anymore. The strangest part is that Marissa had lived with my dad, so she didn't know anything about what I had been seeing in that house. I had never told her about that awful night in the bathroom, or the thing that ran into my room. But after she cleansed me, I never saw it again. I'm 25 now, and I still think about it sometimes. It still gives me chills, because the idea that something like that might have been following me when I was just a kid is honestly terrifying. And part of me still wonders, what would have happened if my sister hadn't stepped in that night? Hi. I want to tell you about something that happened when I was a kid. Something I've carried with me for years. It's been more than a decade now, and even after all this time, I still don't have a clean explanation for what my sister and I saw that day. I was about 12 when I went to stay with my grandmother in a quiet village in western Ukraine. She had this beautiful little garden behind her house, full of flower beds she cared for like they were family. She loved flowers, especially the first ones that came up in spring. So one morning, when the snowdrops had just started blooming, she asked me to go into the forest and bring some back for her. My older sister, Katerina, came with me. She was 19 then, and honestly, I was glad she was there. The forest wasn't terribly far, but to reach it, you had to cross a wide field that climbed sharply uphill. At the top of that slope, the trees began. Before the field, we passed a few houses standing away from the rest of the village, and then we came by an old abandoned military base. That place already had a bad feeling to it. Broken concrete, rusted metal, empty buildings with dark windows, and that strange kind of silence that makes every small sound feel too loud. We wandered around there for a little while, just being nosy and careless the way kids can be. Then we kept going toward the forest. But there was one place on that hillside that always felt different. About halfway up the slope, there was a mound of land pushing out from the hill, almost like it didn't belong there. In the middle of it stood 3 enormous oak trees, arranged in a near-perfect triangle. I remember looking at them even before anything happened and feeling uncomfortable, though I couldn't have told you why. The air around them just felt heavy. We reached the forest, picked a basket full of snowdrops, and started heading back down through the field. On the way, I noticed small clumps of dry grass or straw scattered all over the ground. I started stepping on them for fun, just crunching them under my shoes. My sister looked at me and said, very seriously, "Stop doing that. You might wake something." I laughed it off. I thought she was just trying to scare me. But a few minutes later, as we were walking downhill, I suddenly felt something change. It was this sharp, cold feeling, like someone was standing behind us and staring straight into my back. I don't know why, but I had to turn around. So I did. I looked back toward the hill with the 3 oak trees, and there, right between them, I saw a woman. Except she wasn't standing, she was floating. She wore a long white dress, and her black hair hung down over her face so completely that I couldn't see any features at all. She was just suspended there between those trees, not touching the ground, not moving like a normal person would move, just hanging in the air. For a second, my mind tried to make it into something ordinary. A branch, a cloth, a trick of light, anything. I blinked several times, but she stayed there. Then I grabbed my sister's arm and whispered for her to look. I'll never forget what happened to her face. Her eyes went wide, wider than I had ever seen them, and her whole body stiffened. Then her hand started shaking in mine. She didn't scream. She barely made a sound. She just whispered, "Run!" And we ran. We tore down that field as fast as we could, the basket bouncing, flowers flying everywhere behind us. I looked back once while we were running, only a few seconds later. There was nothing there anymore. The space between the oaks was empty. We didn't stop until we were far from the hill, maybe a kilometer away. By then, we had lost almost all the snowdrops. We were breathless, shaken, and too scared to even argue about what we had seen. When we got back and told our grandmother, her face changed. She said that during World War II, people had been tortured and killed near those 3 oak trees. According to her, Jews and Ukrainians had been executed there by German soldiers. That stayed with me. What stayed with me even more is that, years later, I began hearing similar stories from other people. One friend told me she once stayed at a country house near a forest. Late at night, she stepped out onto the balcony and saw a white figure in the distance, a woman with long, dark hair moving between the trees. But she said the same thing we had seen. It didn't look like walking. It looked like floating. I still don't know what we saw that day. Some people might call it a banshee. Others would say witch, spirit, restless soul, or just some dark energy left behind by terrible things. I don't know. All I know is that the fear I felt on that hillside was real. The silence, the trees, that white figure between them, my sister's shaking hand in mine, all of it stayed with me. And even now, whenever I think about those 3 oak trees, I feel that same cold pressure in my chest. So I have to ask, has anyone else ever seen something like that? I know how this is going to sound, and honestly, I've wondered plenty of times if I'm just imagining things. My family says I'm probably exhausted, that I'm not sleeping enough, and maybe that would be easier to believe if this kind of thing happened to me everywhere. But it doesn't. I've stayed in other homes. I've lived in other places. And nothing has ever felt the way it feels at my mom's house. I'm 24 now, but I've been seeing and hearing things since I was little, maybe around 6 or 7. The house I grew up in was badly haunted. There's no softer way to put it. Then, when I was 16, my parents moved us into a newer house. The house itself wasn't old, but we never really knew much about the land it was built on. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I went away to college. Every now and then, my mom and stepdad would leave town, and I'd come back to watch the house and take care of their 3 little dogs. So it would just be me there, alone, with the dogs. One night, I was lying on the couch. It was late, somewhere between 1 and 3 in the morning. The dogs were settled around me, and the house was quiet. Then I heard tiny footsteps on the stairs behind me. Not a creak, not the house settling. Footsteps. I turned around, expecting to see one of the dogs, or something, anything. But there was nothing there. The next night, I told myself I was going to bed early. It was around 11, and I remember thinking, just a few more minutes, then I'll go upstairs. Then I heard the dog's kennel slam shut. It was loud enough that I immediately thought one of them had gone inside it. But when I looked beside me, all 3 dogs were right there on the couch. I didn't even get up to check. I just lay down fast, pulled the blanket over myself, and stayed still. The room had this awful feeling, like something was standing there, watching me. Years later, I was up late sketching in the living room. The house was quiet again. Then I heard footsteps coming down the carpeted stairs, followed by this wet little slap sound on the hardwood beside me. I looked. Nothing. Another time, I was home alone watching a documentary about Judith Barcy, the little girl who voiced Anne Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven. Before the video even ended, a framed photo that had been hanging on the wall for years suddenly fell. No one touched it. No door slammed. It just dropped. For a while, I moved away. Then one weekend, I came home to visit, and my mom told me something had happened to her. She said she had been asleep when a man yelled at her. It woke her up, and when she opened her eyes, she saw a man standing at her bedroom door. Then he turned, walked away, and disappeared. About 2 weeks after that, I was taking a nap in my old room. It was the middle of the day. When I woke up, I saw someone walk past my doorway. At first, I thought it was my stepdad. But then the man stopped, leaned his head into my room, and walked toward me. He didn't walk around my desk. He walked through it. Then he vanished. I didn't have my glasses on, so I couldn't make out his face clearly. He just looked like a regular man. And I know what people usually say, but I don't have sleep paralysis. I could move. I was awake. It was daylight. I waited a little while because I wanted to see if my stepdad would actually pass by my door. Eventually, he did. I asked him if he had looked into my room earlier, even though I already knew the answer. He said no. My mom also says she hears someone walking around in my old bedroom, which is right above hers. One night, I was heading upstairs to my room, and I saw a figure standing across the hall in another bedroom doorway. At first, I tried to explain it away. I told myself it was just the lights making a shape. But the next night, I looked again. The shape wasn't there. There are also nights when I'm lying in bed, and I swear I hear the TV on downstairs. Voices, low and muffled, like someone left it playing. But when I open my door, the house is silent. Recently, I moved back home. I don't really sleep in my room anymore. I sleep in my mom's room because mine scares me too much, and she doesn't sleep in the same room as my stepdad anyway. I've tried a few times to sleep in my own bed again, but lately, it's gotten strange. One night, I was lying there on my phone when I suddenly felt someone rub my back. I left immediately. Another morning, when it was already light outside, I was still half asleep when I felt someone stroke my leg. I was so tired that I just ignored it and went back to sleep. Then it happened again the next day, and tonight, I left my room because I felt my hair move. That was enough for me. The reason I think it's connected to the house is because this doesn't follow me everywhere. I've lived in other places. I've stayed in other houses. Only 2 places have ever felt this way, and my mom's house is one of them. And yes, there's a mirror facing my bed. I've tried covering it, but my parents keep taking the cover down. I don't know what's in that house. I just know I don't like being alone in my room anymore. Okay, I'll tell you what happened as clearly as I can. There were 4 of us in the car that night. Me, Arun, driving. My girlfriend, Pia, was in the passenger seat. Rohan was in the back, doing what he always did, talking non-stop. And beside him was Sanika, his older sister. Sanika was usually gentle, easy to laugh with. But that night, she was quiet. She just kept looking out at the road, almost like she was waiting for something to appear. We were driving back from a wedding in Jaisalmer. It was a long drive, around 300 kilometers, and we started much later than we should have. By the time we got onto the highway, it was close to midnight. Around 2:30 in the morning, the road became empty in a way that felt wrong. No shops, no houses, no trucks. Not even dogs barking somewhere in the distance. Just the headlights stretching forward and darkness pressing in from every side. Then, at 2:49 a.m., we reached a crossroads. I only saw it for a second. Something was lying in the middle of the junction. Small, dark, arranged too carefully to be random. Rohan saw it just before I did. He said, "Arun, wait." But I couldn't stop in time. The front tire went over it. The sound it made still bothers me. It wasn't loud. That was the worst part. It was soft, almost delicate, like cloth tearing underwater. But somehow, I knew we had broken something we were never supposed to touch. Pia sucked in a breath beside me. I slowed down and asked, "What was that?" Before anyone could answer, Sanika said from the back seat, "Don't stop. Keep driving." There was no panic in her voice, no fear, just this flat, empty certainty. So I kept driving. For a while, nobody said anything. Later, Pia told me what she saw when she looked back through the rear window. There was a red circle painted on the road. In the center was a clay lamp, turned upside down, with smoke still rising from the wick. Around it was a black thread tied with knots, and there was a folded note lying beside it. She didn't tell us then. I think she was afraid that saying it out loud would make it real. The first strange thing was the GPS. It said the next town was 47 kilometers away. Then we passed a milestone that said the same thing. 47 kilometers. 7 or 8 minutes later, we passed it again. Same faded paint. Same crack through the number 4. I tried to explain it away. I told myself maybe there were 2 signs. Maybe I was tired. Then the radio came on. The radio wasn't even connected. I had pulled the cable out earlier because the signal kept cutting in and out. But a song started playing anyway. It was an old devotional song, sung by a woman with a cracked voice. It played for maybe half a minute, then stopped. Then it started again from the beginning. Sanika whispered, "I know that song." Rohan asked her how. She said, "They played it outside my grandmother's house after she died." After that, the car felt colder. At 3:06, we saw a dog on the left side of the road. It was dead, lying on its side with a wound across its back. We drove past it. A few minutes later, there it was again. Same dog, same wound, same position. I told Pia it had to be another dog. The third time we saw it, it was sitting upright, facing us. I don't like remembering what happened after that. There was a figure standing on the right side of the road. Tall. Too tall. It had its back to us and didn't move at all, even when we passed close enough that the air from the car should have shifted its clothes. I checked the mirror. There was nothing there. Then Pia grabbed my arm so hard her nails went into my skin. She was pointing at the back seat. I looked in the rearview mirror. Rohan was there. Sanika was there. And between them, there was something else. I don't know how to describe it without sounding insane. It had the shape of a person, kind of. A head, shoulders, a body. But the face was blank. Not covered, not hidden. Just smooth skin where the face should have been. Pia was the only one who could see it clearly. Rohan was still talking, and Sanika kept staring through the windshield like she already knew it was there. I looked back at the road and didn't check the mirror again. A little later, Rohan disappeared. He had been mid-sentence. He was telling some story from the wedding, something about his cousin dropping a tray of sweets. Then he just stopped. Not slowly, not like he got distracted. He stopped as if someone had cut the sound out of him. We somehow reached a red light, which makes no sense because there are no traffic lights on that stretch of highway. But I stopped, turned around, and Rohan's seat was empty. His snack packet was still there, placed neatly in the middle of the seat. I touched the seat. It was warm. The door had never opened. Pia had been staring at it the whole time after she saw that thing sitting between them. There were other things after that. The phones all showing different times. A car that looked exactly like mine appearing ahead of us, then rolling backward toward us with no driver inside. Pia trying to scream and no sound coming out. But the part I think about most is what Sanika did. She asked me to pull over. Her voice was soft then. Sad, almost. She told us that what we drove over at the crossroads was a kind of trap. Something left there during a ritual. She said it was meant to catch a soul. Maybe a particular one, maybe anyone unlucky enough to cross the boundary. She said when we drove through it, we carried it with us. Then she said something that still makes my chest hurt. She said, "It was calling me from the beginning." Her phone had died the moment we crossed that place. She said she understood then, but she hoped she was wrong. She opened the door. I begged her not to. She looked at me and said, "Don't stop. Don't look back. Just drive until the road ends." Then she stepped out, and I drove. I hate saying that, but I drove. 12 minutes later, the road opened onto a main highway. There were streetlights, a petrol station, a man sweeping near the pumps like it was the most ordinary night in the world. The time was 3:16 a.m. Sanika's seat was empty. Her phone was lying there, unlocked. The battery showed 100%. On the screen was a map I had never seen before. Not Google Maps, not any app I recognized. It showed one thin road, just one. And on that road, there was a blue dot, moving. At the petrol station, the man looked into our car for a long time. Then he asked, "Were there 3 of you or 4?" I told him 3. He didn't believe me. I could see that. He handed me the bottle of water I had asked for, but his eyes stayed on the back seat. Rohan is still missing. The police report says he was last seen at the wedding venue. There's no camera footage of our car on that highway. No record of the road we took. I've searched every map I can find, satellite images, local surveys, everything. That road doesn't exist. But Sanika's phone still works. The battery has never dropped below 100%. And the blue dot is still moving.